So you're settling in. The lights are low, or maybe they're already off, and you found yourself here because the wasteland has a way of calling people back even when they're trying to rest. Whatever brought you to this video tonight, you're about to spend the next couple of hours inside one of the strangest, most richly detailed, most quietly brilliant universes that video games have ever produced. This is Fallout, and there are exactly 101 things about it worth knowing. Things about its creation, its lore, its secrets, its mistakes, its music, its monsters, and the remarkable people who built it out of almost nothing and watched it become a global phenomenon. We're going to take our time. There's no rush. Just settle in. Part 1, The Strange and Difficult Birth of a Franchise. Fact 1. Fallout was never supposed to be Fallout. The game that would eventually become one of the most beloved RPG franchises in history began its life not as an original concept, but as an attempt to continue something that had already ended. In 1988, a studio called Interplay Productions released a game called Wasteland, published by Electronic Arts. Wasteland dropped players into a post-nuclear American Southwest and let them wander, make choices, and survive in ways that felt genuinely open for its era. It sold around 250,000 copies, which was significant for the mid-1980s PC market, and it left both its creators and its fanbase hungry for more. Brian Fargo, one of Interplay's founders, desperately wanted to make a sequel. He had a concept. He had a team. He had the creative will. What he did not have was the intellectual property. Electronic Arts owned Wasteland, and they were not interested in returning those rights. So Fargo could not make a sequel to his own game. What he could do was make something new. Something that carried the same DNA, the same feeling of a civilization that had worked very hard to destroy itself, and mostly succeeded, the same sense of open possibility in a landscape of closed futures. And so, from a licensing frustration and a creative longing, the project that would become Fallout was born. It was not the game Brian Fargo had wanted to make, it was the game he made instead. And it turned out to be better. Fact 2. Tim Kaine began working on the Fallout prototype in 1994, and for the first stretch of that development, the project barely had a team. Kaine was essentially a one-person operation within Interplay, quietly building something new while the company's attention and resources were directed elsewhere. Interplay at this time was investing heavily in sports games, in licensed properties, in commercial products that felt safe. The Fallout project looked risky and niche. From the outside, a dark, morally complex, post-apocalyptic RPG with no obvious precedent and uncertain commercial potential. It nearly got canceled twice. Both times, the reasoning came down to the same calculation. Those resources would be better spent on safer investments. Both times, Kaine and the small team that had gathered around him managed to continue anyway, partly through persistence and partly because Interplay's attention was simply elsewhere. The game grew in the gaps between the things the company actually cared about. Leonard Boyarsky joined as art director. Chris Taylor joined as a designer. A small group of collaborators accumulated, each attracted by the same quality that made the project so easy to overlook from the outside. Because nobody was watching. Nobody was telling them what they had to make. They could build what they actually wanted. That freedom, purchased entirely by obscurity, produced something that had no real precedent in the industry. Fact 3. The aesthetic and tonal identity of Fallout was not assembled randomly. The developers were, almost without exception, children of the Cold War people who grew up with the ambient anxiety of nuclear annihilation as a permanent background note to daily life, normalized and unacknowledged but always present. They drew from Mad Max for visual grammar, from A Boy and His Dog, the 1975 film, for the tone of dark humor applied to genuine survival horror. From 1940s and 1950s, pulp science fiction for the retro-futuristic aesthetic of ray guns and chrome robots and gleaming atomic optimism. But perhaps most importantly, they drew from the actual civil defense culture of post-war America, the government pamphlets explaining what a prepared American family should do if a nuclear weapon went off nearby, the animated films teaching children to duck and cover, the advertising campaigns presenting nuclear energy as the friendly, modern power source of a prosperous future. These documents were not satirical, they were sincere. They expressed a genuine cultural belief that the nuclear threat could be managed, could be survived, could be incorporated into ordinary life without requiring fundamental change. Fallout took that belief and let it collide with what nuclear weapons actually produce. The collision is the game. The specific flavor of it, cheerfulness painted directly over catastrophe, 1950s. Graphic design language applied to the end of civilization is what makes Fallout feel like itself, regardless of which entry you're playing. Fact 4. Before Fallout had its final character system, the game was going to use GURPS, the generic universal role-playing system, developed by Steve Jackson Games. The developers thought it was a natural fit, flexible, mechanically deep, suitable for any genre. The license was signed. Work began on what was formally titled Fallout, a GURPS post-nuclear adventure. Then the team finished their opening cinematic. The sequence established the game's tone immediately. Dark, violent, uncomfortable. A prisoner being led somewhere waves at the camera and is shot in the head. Steve Jackson saw it and was definitively not on board. Brian Fargo has described it simply. He knew what kind of world they were building, and the opening was just a warm-up. Jackson saw the same footage and reached the opposite conclusion about whether it was acceptable. The license ended. The team was left without a character system and needed a solution fast. Fact 5. The solution that emerged from the GURPS collapse became the franchise's mechanical backbone. Christopher Taylor, one of Fallout's designers, created the Specular system's strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck under genuine time pressure, writing the foundation on index cards and scraps of grid paper wherever ideas came to him. Taylor drew from his deep knowledge of tabletop RPGs and from a clear understanding of what Fallout specifically needed its character system to express, not just mechanically, but thematically. The choice to make charisma and intelligence primary attributes, equal in the hierarchy to strength and endurance, says something important about the game's values. Social and intellectual capability are genuine survival tools in the wasteland, not secondary abilities. A high-intelligence character receives more skill points per level, giving them dramatically more options throughout the game. A high-charisma character finds that other survivors respond to them differently, opening paths through conversations that violence would simply close. The system was built to support the franchise's core belief that there are many ways to survive in a ruined world, and none of them is simply correct. It survived multiple development teams, the transition from Interplay to Bethesda, the shift from isometric to first-person, and nearly 3 decades of franchise evolution. It is still there. Fact 6. The team that built the original Fallout was remarkably small. At its peak, around 30 people. Modern AAA games regularly employ hundreds of staff, sometimes thousands across multiple studios, and they still frequently ship with design inconsistencies and tonal incoherence. Fallout was made by approximately 30 individuals who were deeply and personally invested in what they were building, working closely enough together that there were no silos and no meaningful distance between what any one person was doing and what the others knew. The writing knew what the art was doing. The art knew what the design was doing. The smallness of the team was not a limitation on what was possible. It was the condition under which the game's specific coherence became possible. Every element feels like it came from the same creative mind, not because one person made it, but because 30 people working that closely together produced something with the unified quality that larger, more compartmentalized productions often lack. Fact 7. Fallout was released on the 9th of October, 1997 in North America, and both its critical and commercial success exceeded what Interplay had expected. The game sold more than 500,000 copies worldwide. It won Role-Playing Game of the Year from both GameSpot and Computer Games Magazine. It received nominations from the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences. And in the years since, it has been consistently listed among the greatest video games ever made, credited with demonstrating that the RPG genre had not exhausted its possibilities, and with influencing a generation of subsequent games in ways that extend well beyond the franchise itself. None of this was predicted. The game succeeded because its creators made it exactly as they wanted to make it, without commercial interference, and because what they wanted to make turned out to resonate far more broadly than anyone had expected. Fact 8. Fallout 2, released in 1998, was made under significantly more pressure and by a partially different team. Tim Kaine left Interplay during its development, before the game was finished, to co-found Troika Games alongside Leonard Boyarsky and Jason Anderson. The sequel that was completed without its original architect was enormous by almost any measure, the biggest RPG ever made at that point, covering more geography, more quests, more possible approaches to the world than the original. It also shows the seams of its production, the more pop culture references that occasionally feel jarring. There are stretches where the tone is more broadly comedic than the setting quite supports. But Fallout 2 is also, in the ways that matter, the most ambitious entry the franchise has ever attempted, a game that reached so far it occasionally overextended itself, and that players have loved and debated for 25 years precisely because of that ambition. Fact 9. The years between Fallout 2 and Bethesda's acquisition of the franchise were almost a decade of near-continuous crisis for the property. Interplay was acquired by Titus Interactive in 2001, and the new parent company's focus on console gaming over PC development put enormous pressure on Black Isle Studios. Projects were canceled, redirected, or transformed into things barely recognizable as part of the series. Fallout Tactics: Brotherhood of Steel, developed by Micro Forte and released in 2001, moved away from the open-world RPG format to focus on squad-based tactical combat. It was later declared non-canonical by Bethesda. Then came Fallout: Brotherhood of Steel in 2004, a console action game with linear levels, heavy metal music, and minimal connection to what had made the original game special. It was widely considered the franchise's creative low point. It was the last Fallout game under Interplay's ownership, and its failure contributed to the decision to sell the franchise. That sale would change everything. Fact 10. Before Bethesda Softworks took ownership, there was already another Fallout 3 in development at Black Isle Studios. Codenamed Van Buren after the 8th President of the United States, because Black Isle had a tradition of giving projects presidential codenames, it would have been an isometric RPG in the tradition of the first two games, using a new engine with 3D rendering while maintaining a top-down perspective. The story was set in the American Southwest in 2253, following an escaped prisoner navigating faction conflicts while trying to prevent a rogue scientist from using a nuclear orbital weapon system to restart global nuclear exchange. The project had been in development for around 6 months when Interplay's financial collapse forced the closure of the entire Black Isle PC development department on the 8th of December 2003. Design documents, leaked in 2005 and 2006, ran to hundreds of pages. A tech demo followed in 2007. Caesar's Legion, Hoover Dam, and numerous other elements of what eventually became Fallout. New Vegas grew from concepts first developed for Van Buren, brought back by Obsidian Entertainment, a studio founded by former Black Isle developers, many of whom had worked on the canceled project themselves. If you're watching this somewhere in the world right now, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is there. I read all of them, and if you haven't subscribed, now's a great moment. Let's keep going. Part 2 Special: The Architecture of the Wasteland and the World Behind the Games. Fact 11. The special system communicates its values through its structure. That it places charisma and intelligence alongside strength and endurance as primary attributes is not just a mechanical decision. It is a statement about what the game believes survival in the wasteland requires. A pure combat build in Fallout can kill most things. But a character built around intelligence and charisma can navigate the wasteland in ways that violence simply cannot, through conversation, through understanding other people's motivations, through building relationships that open paths the combat-focused character will never see. High intelligence gives more skill points per level, expanding the character's capabilities dramatically over time. High charisma changes how NPCs respond, how companions perform, which options are available in dialogue. The mechanical structure of Special encodes the argument that social and intellectual capability are legitimate survival tools, not secondary features. This argument runs through every entry in the franchise. However, the specific implementation has evolved. Fact 12. Tim Kaine wrote the prologue of the original Fallout, and War never changes became one of the most recognizable opening lines in the history of video games. He wrote it as a thesis statement, an anchor for everything the franchise intended to explore. The phrase sounds like a truism at first, the kind of thing that seems profound late at night and hollow by morning. but in context, it accumulates real weight. The Great War of 2077 that destroyed civilization was not an aberration. It was the predictable endpoint of specific human tendencies operating at scale. The resource wars over dwindling petroleum reserves, the annexation of Canada, the prolonged ground conflict in Alaska, the escalating desperation of multiple great powers. And in the wasteland that the bombs left behind, the survivors were already organizing new conflicts over water, territory, and ideology. The phrase is not a celebration of violence. It is an elegy for a species that keeps making the same choices in different packaging. Fact 13. The Fallout universe diverges from our own history at a specific and deliberately placed point somewhere between 1945 and 1961 in the post-war years. In reality, transistor miniaturization drove electronics toward the digital revolution over the following decades. In Fallout's timeline, this chain of development does not occur. Electronics stay large, vacuum tube powered, and nuclear fueled. The 1950s never aesthetically gave way to anything newer. Consumer goods, architecture, design language all remain frozen in mid-century Americana. Yet the same civilization developed nuclear fusion power, functional artificial intelligence, sophisticated robotics, holographic technology, and biochemical treatments that are either miraculous or horrifying depending on which vault you're exploring. The world is advanced in some directions and stagnant in others, a specific asymmetry that creates the franchise's distinctive atompunk aesthetic and makes it feel internally coherent rather than arbitrarily retro. Fact 14. The Master, the primary antagonist of the original Fallout, was designed with a specific ambition: to create a villain you could engage with intellectually, not just fight. He had used the forced evolutionary virus to transform humans into super mutants and was building an army of them, planning the systematic replacement of baseline humanity with this new form. His reasoning was coherent within his own framework. Humanity had proven its capacity for self-destruction, and the super mutant physiology was more durable and resistant to the post-war environment. He was wrong in a specific and devastating way. The FEV transformation produced sterile beings, meaning his plan would end with the extinction of the species he was trying to save. The player could discover this and confront him with it. The Master could be talked down from his plan through a conversation. He could be convinced that his entire project was biologically impossible. When he understood this, he ended himself. He was the franchise's first villain, and he set the standard. People with reasons, people whose reasons were worth engaging with, people who were wrong in ways that mattered. Fact 15. The guiding creative philosophy of the original Fallout was articulated by Tim Kaine as, "Do what you want, so long as you can accept the consequences." The team wanted a world that responded to what the player did not, through moral lectures or arbitrary punishments, but through organic consequence. If you became addicted to drugs, the addiction required management. If you killed civilians, factions noticed and adjusted. If you made choices that helped one group at another's expense, the memories persisted in both directions. This philosophy of consequence without moralizing gave the game a feeling of genuine weight, the sense that what you did actually mattered because the world was paying attention rather than judging you. Fact 16. The Brotherhood of Steel, one of the franchise's most recurring factions, was deliberately not heroic in the original Fallout. They were preservationists at best, hoarders at worst, a group that had accumulated significant technological knowledge and power and showed no interest in sharing either with the people dying in the wasteland around them. This was a conscious choice to prevent the player from having an obvious good guy faction. Every major group in the original Fallout had something sympathetic about it and something troubling. The Brotherhood was no exception. This approach to faction design, every group defensible, every group criticizable, became one of the franchise's defining characteristics and the template for the NCR, Caesar's Legion, the Institute, and every subsequent major faction. Fact 17. The Great War of the 23rd of October 2077 lasted approximately 2 hours. In those 2 hours, the nuclear arsenals of at least 2 major powers were deployed, reducing population centers to irradiated craters and initiating decades of ecological devastation. The fallout that followed, heavy with ash and radioactive contamination, killed survivors who hadn't reached shelters. Species exposed to sustained radiation across multiple reproductive generations began to change. Rad scorpions are mutated emperor scorpions. Mirelurks are descended from horseshoe crabs and snapping turtles. Yao guai are mutated black bears. Deathclaws were specifically engineered from Jackson's chameleons as battlefield replacements for human infantry during the resource wars, before escaping into the wild and continuing to evolve. The wasteland's ecological horror is grounded in specific and internally consistent biology, and understanding it this way makes the creatures you encounter feel less like fantasy monsters and more like what biology actually does under extreme pressure. Fact 18. Power armor in the Fallout universe has a specific history that begins decades before the Great War. The T-45 model was developed in the 2050s and first deployed on the Chinese mainland in 2066, the first powered infantry armor ever used in live combat. The T-51 improved on it significantly in terms of mobility, protection, and life support. The T-60 was developed in the late pre-war period and became the Brotherhood of Steel's standard equipment in Fallout 4. The X-1, developed post-war by the Enclave, pushed beyond conventional armor engineering into territory the war had made moot before it could be deployed. Each model is a chapter in a specific historical narrative about military ambition, technological development, and the enormous human cost of both. When you climb into a suit of power armor in a Fallout game, you are wearing 2 centuries of history. Fact 19. The licensed music that plays on the in-game radio stations across the Bethesda Fallout games was selected with genuine care. The songs chosen for Galaxy News Radio, Mojave Music Radio, and Diamond City Radio are from the 1940s and 1950s, and they were picked for their specific relationship to the world they play over. Anything Goes is about a world that can afford permissiveness. I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire is a love song that uses nuclear language casually, which in context becomes something else entirely. Playing music that expresses optimism, normalcy, and domestic contentment over scenes of irradiated rubble creates a specific emotional effect. The cheerfulness of the music makes the destruction more terrible, not less. This is the technique that the franchise borrowed from the civil defense films of the 1950s themselves. Cheerful presentation as a frame for something genuinely frightening. Fact 20. Bethesda Softworks purchased the Fallout intellectual property in 2007 for approximately $5.75 million, after first licensing the right to develop a Fallout game from Interplay in 2004 for $1.17 million. The deal included a provision allowing Interplay to continue developing a Fallout MMO, which became the subject of a lawsuit when Interplay failed to meet development milestones. The dispute was settled in 2012, when Bethesda paid Interplay $2 million in exchange for Interplay surrendering all remaining rights to the franchise. From that point, the entire Fallout intellectual property belonged to Bethesda Softworks' every character, every piece of established lore, every game in the series. A franchise that had nearly been canceled multiple times and had passed through multiple crises now belonged to one of the industry's most commercially powerful studios. What Bethesda did with it would define the franchise for an entirely new generation. Part 3, Vault Boy, the Pip-Boy, and the Icons of the Wasteland. Fact 21. Leonard Boyarsky created Vault Boy during the development of the original Fallout, beginning with a sketch he made specifically to communicate a visual idea to the rest of the team. He described the character's earliest existence as the skill guy, a figure whose purpose was to illustrate the game's skills and statistics in a way that felt tonally appropriate. The sketch passed to artist George Almond, who drew the first official cards. Then Tramiel Ray Isaac T. Ray took over and finalized the look that became iconic. The swirled blonde hair, the round, cheerful face, the yellow and blue Vault-Tec jumpsuit, the expression of unflappable confidence that manages to be both reassuring and vaguely unsettling simultaneously. Brian Menze drew all of the Vault Boy images for Fallout 2 and later New Vegas, following the style Isaac established. Natalia Smirnova drew the Fallout 3 versions. Across decades and multiple artists, the character remained recognizably himself, a remarkable feat of visual consistency. Fact 22. Vault Boy's primary design inspiration was Rich Uncle Pennybags, the mascot of the Monopoly board game. Boyarsky specifically asked Tramiel Isaac to draw something like Mr. Moneybags in Monopoly. The connection, once you see it, is obvious. Both are cheerful mascots for systems that generate wildly unequal outcomes, both presented with permanent good humor. The format of the Vault Boy illustrations, small cards showing the character engaged in activities specific to a perk or skill, was explicitly modeled on Monopoly's community chest and chance cards. Within the broader thematic context of the franchise, the comparison deepens. Vault-Tec, whose corporate mascot Vault Boy was systematically running experiments on the people it claimed to protect. A cheerful mascot for a monstrous corporation, modeled on the cheerful mascot of a game built around accumulating wealth at others' expense. The rhyme is not coincidental. Fact 23. The fan theory about Vault Boy's thumbs-up pose has become so widely circulated that it is now effectively part of the character's cultural identity, regardless of original intent. The theory holds that Vault Boy is demonstrating a nuclear blast survival technique, holding your thumb up at arm's length, closing one eye, and checking whether the mushroom cloud exceeds your thumb's width. If it does, you're in the blast radius. The U.S. Department of Energy has clarified that this is not a historically documented survival method. The original developers have said they did not intend this meaning. But the 2024 Amazon Prime television series chose to embrace the interpretation and make it part of Vault Boy's canonical in-universe origin, giving the gesture specific emotional weight within the show's narrative. A piece of fan theory became official lore through enthusiasm, resonance, and a writer's room that recognized a good idea when they encountered one. Fact 24. For years, an enormous number of players called Vault Boy Pip Boy, and the history of how this era propagated is its own small piece of Fallout lore. The Pip Boy is the wrist-mounted computer issued to Vault Dwellers, a device manufactured by Robco Industries, tracking statistics, managing inventory, playing radio, displaying maps. Vault Boy is a cartoon mascot. They are entirely separate things. The confusion was introduced by Microforte, the studio that developed Fallout Tactics in 2001, which labeled Vault Boy as Pip Boy in their materials. This error then appeared in the Fallout Bible, the canonical lore document written by Chris Avellone, which spread it further. Bethesda corrected the record when they took over the franchise. However, in a moment of genuine corporate poetry, the trademark filings for the character still use the name Pip Boy, because somewhere in a legal department, no one updated the paperwork. Fact 25. Time magazine ranked Vault Boy the third most influential video game character of all time. Empire placed him among the 50 greatest video game characters. Critics have compared his cultural recognition to Mickey Mouse. These are extraordinary accolades for a character who does not exist as a person in the Fallout universe, who cannot be met, spoken to, or otherwise interacted with. He exists purely as in-universe corporate branding, on advertising materials, in training films, on the Pip-Boy interface, on bobbleheads scattered across the wasteland. He is the frozen smile of a corporation whose true nature was monstrous, preserved on every piece of Vault-Tec merchandise that survived 2 centuries of radiation and neglect. The fact that this character, with no narrative and no story of his own, became one of gaming's most recognizable mascots is either a testament to extraordinary visual design or a profound statement about the power of corporate branding. Likely both. Fact 26. The Pip-Boy device, the wrist-mounted personal computer that serves as the game's menu interface, was, according to Leonard Boyarsky, designed with a different mascot inspiration than Vault Boy. While Vault Boy came from Monopoly's rich Uncle Pennybags, the Pip-Boy's cartoon mascot was inspired by the Bob's Big Boy restaurant mascot, the chubby, pompadoured, grinning boy who has served as the visual identity of an American diner chain since 1936. The name Pip-Boy stands for Personal Information Processor, manufactured by Robco Industries and issued to Vault Dwellers in partnership with Vault-Tec. The device was designed to outlast its wearers, powered by a fission battery rated for a lifespan exceeding any reasonable human lifespan, and some models included biometric locks that prevented removal from a living wearer. That detail, rarely foregrounded in the games, gives the Pip-Boy a quietly unsettling quality. The player character has had this machine attached to their wrist since before they could speak. Fact 27. During the development of Fallout 2, Brian Menze was asked to create a Vault Boy illustration for the child killer reputation, a status earned by killing child characters in the game. His solution was a cheerfully grinning vault boy kicking a pregnant woman in the stomach. He has explained that this was the least offensive way he could think of to represent the concept visually through the Vault Boy illustration style. Both Menze and the designer who requested the image subsequently agreed it was inappropriate. It was cut. It is the only Vault Boy illustration in the franchise's history that was removed, before shipping the single image where the character's habitual cheerfulness was considered, even by the creators, to have gone too far. Fact 28. Vault Boy's relationship with Vault-Tec is the franchise's darkest piece of embedded irony. Of the 122 vaults Vault-Tec constructed, only 17 were genuine shelters functioning as they claimed, providing real protection without experimental variables. The remaining 105 were laboratories, each built around a specific social or scientific experiment conducted on an unwitting population. Every advertisement featuring Vault Boy, every training film showing him demonstrating vault safety procedures, every piece of promotional material using his image, all of it was corporate propaganda for an institution engaged in systematic human experimentation on a national scale. Vault Boy smiles through all of it. That is his entire function. He doesn't know what the company he represents is doing, and somehow, that makes everything he represents more terrible, not less. Fact 29. The 2024 Amazon Prime Fallout television series gave Vault Boy a specific human origin that the games had never provided. The character of Cooper Howard, played by Walton Goggins, is revealed to have been Vault-Tec's original brand ambassador before the war, an actor hired to appear in promotional films for the Vaults, whose poses and gestures became the basis for the Vault Boy mascot. The show depicts Cooper performing Vault Boy's signature moves in advertisements, while sincerely believing he is helping people prepare for a possible future catastrophe, unaware that the corporation he's promoting is one of the architects of the catastrophe itself. The revelation that Vault Boy is based on a real person who was betrayed by the company he represented adds genuine human tragedy to an image that had previously operated as pure satire. The cheerful mascot becomes a ghost of the man who smiled for the cameras. Fact 30. The Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV from Fallout 4 was the basis for a remarkable piece of real-world merchandise, a physical wrist-mounted smartphone case sold as part of the game's collector's edition. The case held an iPhone or Android device in a bracket attached to the wearer's wrist, with the phone's screen serving as the Pip-Boy display and a companion app providing the in-game interface. Designed with attention to the aesthetic details of the in-game device, the green display, the round dials, the weathered aluminum finish, it was one of the most sought-after gaming collectibles of 2015 and sold out almost immediately. Its ingenuity was in taking the game's fiction completely seriously. Not a replica prop, but a functional device that made real technology behave, however imperfectly, like the imaginary one. Part 4. The Vaults and Their Dark Secrets. Fact 31. Project Safehouse, the government-contracted program that funded Vault-Tec's vault construction, broke ground in 2054 with a proof-of-concept facility beneath Los Angeles. Construction continued throughout the following decade, and by 2063 the majority of the 122 planned vaults were complete. Each vault was designed to house up to 1,000 inhabitants, with power systems, water recycling, food production, and medical facilities sufficient for indefinite occupation. The stated purpose was exactly what it sounded like: protection for a portion of the American population in the event of nuclear catastrophe. The actual purpose, documented in internal communications and confirmed across multiple games and the television series, was systematic data collection for a secret project whose true goal was the development of knowledge needed to build and successfully operate a generation ship for humanity's departure from a doomed planet. Of the 122 vaults, 17 were control groups functioning as genuine shelters. The other 105 were experiments. The residents had no idea. Fact 32. Vault 101, the starting location in Fallout 3, was designed to never open. Its experiment was about information control and permanent isolation. The Vault's overseer, a planted Vault-Tec operative, was tasked with maintaining the population's belief that the outside world was permanently uninhabitable. The radio transmissions dwellers might receive were pre-recorded before the bombs fell, describing conditions more terrible than the actual wasteland to ensure that no one would attempt to leave. The population was kept underground not by physical constraint but by manufactured belief, sustained across generations through carefully controlled information. When James, the lone wanderer's father, leaves Vault 101 at the beginning of Fallout 3, the community's response is not just surprise, but something closer to epistemological collapse. The departure forces the population to confront the fact that the Vault's founding premise was a lie. The social chaos that follows is as much about this disruption of understanding as it is about any material threat. Fact 33. Vault 108, explorable in Fallout 3, is the franchise's most blackly comic horror location. The Vault was designed with institutional failure built in from the start. Inadequate medical facilities, power systems configured to fail after 20 years, an overseer selected with an expected early death. The experiment appears to have been simple. What happens when you remove functional institutional structure? The answer, assembled from scattered terminal entries and environmental evidence, was predictable. Chaos, collapse, and then Gary. A single resident named Gary became the subject of cloning experiments. His clones, produced repeatedly as the Vault deteriorated, became progressively more aggressive with each iteration. By the time the player arrives, the entire surviving population consists of Gary clones. Every one of them says only Gary. Every one of them attacks on sight. Dozens of identical faces wearing the same expression, articulating the same syllable, with the same intent. It is genuinely frightening. It is also, in the specific register of Fallout horror, perfectly, completely absurd. Fact 34. Vault 87 is not a place where something went wrong. It is a place where something worked exactly as intended, and that is the horror. The Vault was designed as an FEV research facility, using its population as unwitting test subjects for the large-scale development of the forced evolutionary virus. The supermutants who populate the capital wasteland throughout Fallout 3 are the direct descendants of this program, still active, still capturing surface dwellers for mutation. Vault 87 itself is inaccessible from the surface due to extreme radiation, requiring an alternate approach through metro tunnels. When the player arrives, the facility has not stopped. The experiment is still running. Not because anyone is maintaining it or following instructions, but because the super mutants it created have continued the process as a cultural behavior passed across generations. The Vault worked. This is what it looks like when it works. Fact 35. Vault 11 in New Vegas is, in the estimation of many players and critics, the single most effective piece of storytelling in the franchise's history, delivered entirely through environmental discovery. The Vault's experiment was simple in statement. The population must sacrifice one of their own each year, or the Vault systems will execute everyone. What the terminal entries and holotapes reveal, assembled in sequence, is a complete social tragedy. The sacrifice requirement produced political maneuvering and faction formation as different groups worked to ensure that when the annual selection came, it would fall on someone else. The sacrificial chamber was used not for genuine voluntary sacrifice, but as a venue for political disposal. And then, eventually, 5 people refused. The execution protocol activated. And the final audio log played in the chamber, intended to be delivered only when a population finally refused, thanks them for their decision. The experiment is complete. Their refusal was what the test required. The 5 survivors, overwhelmed by the weight of everything that had preceded their refusal, killed themselves. A single Vault got its data. It destroyed the people who provided it. Fact 36. The true purpose behind Vault-Tec's experimental program, the reason data from 105 behavioral experiments was worth gathering at such cost, was the development of knowledge needed to build and operate a generation ship. Vault-Tec's leadership believed nuclear war was inevitable, and that humanity's survival required departure from Earth. The Vault experiments were designed to understand how human populations behave in sealed environments under long-term stress, exactly the conditions that would define life on an interstellar vessel. Only the control vaults functioned as shelters. The experimental vaults were laboratories. The residents were the data. The Great War made the generation ship impossible before the research could be applied. The data was gathered. The ship was never built. The people who provided the data are dead. Fact 37. Vault 21 in New Vegas was a vault where every dispute, resource allocation, and administrative decision was resolved through gambling. All forms of conflict were settled at the game table. The system was stable because it was consistently applied. People accepted probability as an arbiter more readily than they accepted arbitrary authority. The vault reportedly functioned well by Vault-Tec standards until Robert House, the near-immortal casino magnate who controls Las Vegas, played blackjack against the vault's overseer and won. House then acquired the facility, sealed most of its interior in concrete, and converted the accessible portion into a hotel that still operates in New Vegas's present. The transformation of Vault 21 into a functioning business is one of the franchise's most quietly perfect pieces of world building. The logic of the casino economy turned out to be surprisingly compatible with post-war survival. Fact 38. Vault 75 in Fallout 4, located beneath Malden Middle School, is one of the franchise's most disturbing experimental facilities because it hides its horror behind the language of care and scientific progress. Presented to families seeking shelter as an educational facility for children, the vault killed the parents after arrival and subjected the children to intensive physical and psychological training designed to identify individuals with exceptional capabilities, particularly for combat. Those who met the program's standards were enhanced further. Those who did not were removed from the program. Researchers observed from concealed positions, filing clinical reports on individual children's progress. The facility ran for over 20 years. The children processed through Vault 75 never understood what they were part of. They thought they were in school. Fact 39. Vault 81 in Fallout 4 is the franchise's clearest demonstration of what happens when one person with a conscience is placed in a position where they can subvert institutional cruelty at scale. The vault was designed to infect inhabitants with diseases for observation, while Vault-Tec researchers watched from a concealed secondary vault. The facility's first overseer, Dr. Olivet, refused. She sabotaged the disease delivery systems and severed the connection to the observation vault. Because the secondary facility was completely hidden, the main vault's population never knew how close they had come. Vault 81 functioned as a genuine shelter. When the player visits it in Fallout 4, it is one of the only vaults in the game with a healthy, functioning community still inside. Dr. Olivet's decision made alone, in secret, with no audience and no recognition, sustained a community for over 200 years. Fact 40. Vault 22 in New Vegas held botanists and agricultural scientists tasked with developing plants capable of surviving in post-nuclear conditions, genuine work toward a genuinely useful goal. The greenhouse levels inside the vault made real progress. The work was going well. Then a fungal pathogen emerged from the plant population, adapted to the vault's growing conditions, and began infecting the residents. By the time the player visits, the facility is unrecognizable. Roots and vines have broken through walls and ceilings. Fungi cover every surface, and what remains of the human population moves through the undergrowth in a state no longer quite either living or dead. The plants that were supposed to sustain the wasteland consumed the people who were trying to cultivate them. Part 5, Ron Perlman, the soundtrack, and the voice of the wasteland. Fact 41. Ron Perlman's involvement in Fallout began as one of the most routine professional engagements of his career. He was doing extensive voice work in the mid-1990s cartoons, games, commercial productions. His agent sent him to a recording session for a video game narration. He recorded a prologue and an epilogue for a game he knew very little about. He was paid $40. He was also given a sandwich. That is the complete and fully documented compensation for one of the most iconic vocal performances in video game history for War. War never changes. Repeated across 5 mainline franchise entries spanning more than 2 decades. Perlman has been entirely candid about this. He has never played the games, has no particular interest in playing them, and processes his connection to Fallout primarily as curiosity about how 4 words recorded in a standard studio session became permanently attached to his legacy. He is, in this way, perfectly suited to narrate a franchise obsessed with the strange distances between intention and consequence. Fact 42. The line War never changes, appears in Fallout, Fallout 2, Fallout Tactics, Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, and Fallout 76, in each case delivered by Perlman. Fallout 4 departed from this tradition, having Brian T. Delaney, as the male sole survivor, delivered the line, a creative decision that some players found powerful and others found jarring after nearly 2 decades of association between those words and Perlman's specific voice. Fallout. Brotherhood of Steel also did not feature Perlman, using Tony Jay instead. Perlman appeared physically in the franchise in the 2024 Amazon television series as a super mutant, his first on-screen appearance in the universe. After more than a quarter-century of vocal connection to it, completing a circle in the most absurdist possible way. Fact 43. Mark Morgan composed the soundtracks for Fallout and Fallout 2, creating some of the most distinctive game music of the 1990s. Under conditions of significant time pressure, accounts suggest the available window for composition was measured in weeks rather than months. The commission process was atmospheric in its own right. Interplay burned a collection of unlabeled tracks onto a CD and sent it to Morgan with the implicit instruction to make something in the spirit of what they'd selected. Morgan built an ambient score drawing from dark ambient electronic music, industrial sound design, and what he described as the primal quality of the reference material. Tim Kane's taste, he was a fan of Aphex Twin, shaped the direction significantly. Morgan later admitted he was not familiar with Aphex Twin at the time and was essentially working from feel. When Obsidian developed New Vegas in 2010, they licensed several of Morgan's original compositions and incorporated them back into the game in locations that called for a specific quality of age and haunted emptiness, as a deliberate tribute to the score that had defined the franchise's emotional register. Fact 44. Enon Zur's work on the Bethesda Fallout games began with Fallout 3 in 2008 and represents one of the most interesting evolutions in the franchise's musical identity. Where Morgan's scores were spare and atmospheric, built from samples and electronic textures existing between music and sound design, Zur's approach is orchestral and cinematically direct. This was an appropriate response to the kind of game being scored. A first-person open-world experience aimed at a mass audience, designed to be visually and emotionally immediate in ways the original isometric games were not. A score that communicated through subtlety made sense for one kind of experience. A score that communicated through sweeping melody and dynamic range made sense for another. The Fallout 3 score received a BAFTA Games Award nomination for Best Original Score in 2009. The Fallout 4 score received a second BAFTA nomination in 2016. The consistency of recognition suggests the approach worked. Fact 45. The specific songs chosen for the in-game radio stations in the Bethesda Fallout games were selected with genuine care and tonal awareness. Playing Anything Goes over a scene of irradiated rubble, or I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire as the player walks through the burnt ruins of a suburb, creates a specific and deliberate emotional effect. The cheerfulness of the music makes the destruction around it more terrible, not less. It is a technique borrowed from the franchise's own thematic source material, those civil defense films of the 1950s, with their upbeat narration and friendly cartoon figures, instructing families how to manage nuclear catastrophe as though it were a manageable inconvenience. The music in Fallout is the sound of that form of denial, playing on loop in a world where the denial has already failed. Fact 46. I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire by the Ink Spots, the song most closely associated with Fallout 3, was originally recorded in 1941. After the game's release, a new generation of listeners encountered it for the first time, many unaware it was a real recording with real history. The Ink Spots saw an uptick in digital sales following Fallout 3's release. Music stores reported requests for their catalog. The franchise had, entirely as a side effect of its own aesthetic choices, introduced 21st century audiences to mid-century American vocal music. This kind of retroactive cultural discovery, using a post-apocalyptic video game to bridge 8 decades of musical history, is one of the less obvious but genuinely significant things that Fallout has done in its broader cultural reach. Fact 47. Three Dog, the DJ of Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, voiced by Eric Todd Dellums, became one of the game's most beloved characters, largely because of his responsiveness to player actions. He commented on quests the player completed, editorialized about factions and power structures, and provided a continuously updating human narrative thread that made the capital wasteland feel inhabited and reactive. When major events occurred, the destruction or salvation of Megaton, changes in the balance of power, Three Dog reacted, updating his programming to reflect what had happened. The character was a design solution to a specific open-world problem. How do you give a game with non-linear player agency a persistent narrative voice? The answer was to make him a journalist with opinions, paying attention to the world and talking about it on air. Dellums later provided a brief acknowledgement of Three Dogs' continued existence in Fallout 4 without showing the character directly, leaving his fate as one of the Capital Wasteland's pleasant ambiguities. Fact 48. Mr. New Vegas, the radio DJ who hosts Mojave Music Radio in Fallout, New Vegas, was voiced by Wayne Newton, the legendary Las Vegas entertainer whose name was synonymous with the city for decades. This piece of casting is an almost perfect distillation of what New Vegas does best, taking something from the actual history of Las Vegas and using it to give the game's version of the city an additional layer of authenticity and melancholy. Mr. New Vegas is cheerful, professional, charming, and thoroughly disconnected from the violence and suffering outside, which is precisely what makes him both funny and slightly heartbreaking. The game's use of real Las Vegas history and iconography throughout the Mojave setting is one of the most effective pieces of world building in the franchise, and Newton's voice is central to how it works. Fact 49. The Fallout television series received an Emmy Award in 2024 for Outstanding Music Supervision. The show's music team, working under composer Ramin Djawadi, accomplished something technically demanding, blending an original score with a curated library of 1940s and 1950s period recordings in ways that served the show's narrative while honoring the musical tradition the games had established. The Emmy recognized that this had been done successfully. The show's opening sequence depicting the nuclear exchange of 2077 from the perspective of a family at a birthday party in Los Angeles uses music in a way that is genuinely disturbing, with something cheerful and domestic acquiring a dimension of horror as the world outside the window changes in the space of a few seconds. Fact 50. The music of the Fallout franchise is ultimately inseparable from the franchise's broader satirical project. The games use music from the era of optimism, the post-war period when American culture was telling itself a story about prosperity and safety and the promise of the future, and they play it over the ruins of the civilization that told that story. The dissonance is the message. The cheerful songs are not ironic, in the way that a knowing wink is ironic. They are ironic in the way that a sincere belief, sincerely held, becomes ironic when everything it was predicated on has been destroyed. The music in Fallout sounds like the world before the world ended, playing on after the world ended, because there is nothing else to play. Part 6, Fallout 3, and a Capital Wasteland. Fact 51. Bethesda Softworks' approach to the Fallout franchise when they took it over was shaped by a genuine respect for the original games. Todd Howard has described reaching out to former Fallout developers when development began, seeking their perspectives on the setting, the canon, and the philosophical underpinnings of a franchise with this level of history and devotion in its fan base. Several early decisions reflected this respect. Setting Fallout 3 on the East Coast in Washington, D.C., and the surrounding areas allowed Bethesda to build a new part of the wasteland without competing with or contradicting the established West Coast geography of the original games. Placing the game several years after Fallout 2 maintained the series' timeline rather than resetting it. And preserving the special system, the visual aesthetic, and the tonal commitment to moral complexity carried forward what the franchise had always been, even as the perspective shifted from isometric to first-person. Fact 52. The development of Fallout 3 began, by Todd Howard's account, with a single asset, the power armor. Getting it right was Howard's first and most personal priority. He felt that power armor was one of the most essential physical embodiments of what Fallout was, equipment that was simultaneously a piece of military history, a survival tool, and an almost mythological presence in the franchise's visual language. Before maps were drawn, before quests were written, before the geography of the Capital Wasteland was established, the team worked on making the power armor feel right. The game was made by around 100 people at its peak, and it ran for approximately 4 years before its October 2008 release. It sold more than 5 million copies in its first year. Fact 53. The Capital Wasteland is built around the ruins of Washington, D.C., and Bethesda's designers made considerable effort to ensure that the geography was recognizable. The monuments, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial are present and rendered with attention to how they might look after 2 centuries of abandonment and periodic occupation by various post-war factions. The Washington Monument, adapted by the Brotherhood of Steel as a radio tower, is one of the more striking images in the game. The Jefferson Memorial, repurposed as the site of Project Purity, connects the main quest to a specific piece of pre-war American idealism. The use of recognizable real-world geography gives the Capitol Wasteland a quality of resonance that purely invented settings cannot achieve. You are walking through something you've seen photographs of, and it has been destroyed, and that specific destruction carries weight that generic ruins do not. Fact 54. Vault 101 contains a running Easter egg that connects Fallout 3 to Bethesda's other major franchise, The Elder Scrolls. When the player is a child in the game's opening sequence, Butch attempts to take the sweet roll they received as a birthday present. This is a direct reference to a recurring joke in the Elder Scrolls series, a background story about someone who had their sweet roll stolen in an ambush, mentioned across multiple games as minor flavor. Including the sweet roll theft in Fallout 3's opening was Bethesda's way of acknowledging the shared creative heritage between their 2 major RPG franchises. It remains one of the more fondly remembered Easter eggs in either series. Fact 55. The children of Adam in Fallout 3, the religious cult gathered around the unexploded nuclear bomb at the center of Megaton, are a direct reference to the 1970 science fiction film Beneath the Planet of the Apes. In that film, a group of mutated humans worship an ancient nuclear weapon in the ruins of New York City. Fallout 3's Children of Adam transpose this concept into the Fallout universe closely enough that the reference appears intentional. What developed beyond the reference, however, was a faction with surprising depth. The Children of Adam appear across multiple DLC expansions and prominently in Fallout 4, where they have developed genuine theological structure, internal politics, and complex relationships with the communities around them. A reference became a recurring faction with a life of its own. Fact 56. Vault 112, reachable during one of Fallout 3's main quests, houses a virtual reality system called Tranquility Lane. The Vault's overseer, Dr. Stanislaus Braun, placed the entire population into an indefinite simulation of a specific pre-war suburban neighborhood. Braun exists inside the simulation himself, as a small girl, monitoring and manipulating the population from within. The simulation has been running for over 200 years. Residents don't know how long they've been under. Some sense that something is wrong, that time isn't quite behaving correctly, that the same events repeat in ways that can't quite be explained. Braun, who is bored and malevolent, disrupts the simulation periodically for his own entertainment. He has been doing this to the same people for 2 centuries. Players can find a hidden failsafe within the simulation that ends it, but the manner of that ending is itself a moral choice with no clean outcome. Fact 57. Galaxy News Radio can be heard throughout the Capitol Wasteland and responds dynamically to the player's significant choices. Three Dog comments on major events, the destruction or survival of Megaton, shifts in the balance of power between factions, developments in the main quest. This reactive quality, in which a radio DJ acknowledges what has happened in the world as it happens, made the game feel inhabited in a way that was unusual for open-world games of the era. It solved a specific design problem: how to give a non-linear game a continuous narrative voice through character rather than through explicit story structure. Three Dog as a character is the solution to a design problem, and that he became beloved rather than functional is a credit to Eric Todd Dellums' performance and to the writing that gave him opinions worth hearing. Fact 58. The Pip-Boy 3000 by In-Universe Lore was physically attached to the player character's wrist at birth as part of their Vault registration process. The device was not designed to be removed from a living wearer. This detail, present in the game's documentation but rarely foregrounded in the game itself, gives the Pip-Boy an unsettling quality on reflection. The player character has had this machine fused to their wrist since infancy, tracking their vital signs, managing their information, serving as the primary interface between them and any technological system they encounter. It is at once a tool, a medical device, and something close to a body part. This detail becomes more significant and more horrifying when it appears as a plot point in the television series. Fact 59. Rivet City, the settlement built inside a permanently grounded aircraft carrier in the Potomac River, is one of Fallout 3's most impressive pieces of environmental design. The development team worked from historical documentation about real carriers to ensure the ship's internal geography was plausible. The social structure inside the carrier, the marketplace, the research labs, the living quarters, the history of political intrigue rewards players who take the time to read the terminals and speak with the residents in detail. Finding Rivet City for the first time, approaching across the ruined bridge structure that leads to the carrier's hull, feels like discovering a piece of human civilization that has managed to persist against every reasonable expectation. Bethesda designed the approach specifically to produce that sense of discovery, and it works. Fact 60. The Broken Steel DLC for Fallout 3 changed the game's ending retroactively. The original ending required the player character to enter a reactor chamber filled with lethal radiation and activate Project Purity, dying in the process regardless of whether any radiation-immune companion was present, and could have done the same thing. Many players found this frustrating and narratively unconvincing. Broken Steel not only extended the story beyond the original ending, but adjusted the base game to allow a companion to perform the activation if the player chose. It also raised the level cap from 20 to 30 and added substantial new content. The debate about the original ending, whether it was dramatically appropriate or simply an oversight that removed player agency, is one that the Fallout 3 fanbase periodically revives, even now. Fact 61. Fallout 3 contains a reference to a canonical promotional webcomic, One Man, and a crate of puppets written by Jerry Holkins and illustrated by Mike Krahulik of Penny Arcade. In the Paradise Falls Slaver Camp, players can find a Vault 77 jumpsuit and a holotape instructing slavers to destroy it, because it is a relic associated with a legendary figure known as the Puppet Man, who has become a nightmare for slavers across the wasteland. The webcomic told the story of a vault dweller who survived the wasteland using only a crate of puppets, eventually becoming exactly that legendary figure. The in-game reference is careful enough that most players would never recognize it without knowing the comic. It is a gift for people who know where to look. Fact 62. The Lone Wanderer, the player character of Fallout 3, begins the game having been shaped entirely by the controlled environment of the Vault. Unlike the Courier of New Vegas, who is already a working professional in the wasteland economy, or the sole survivor of Fallout 4, who is a pre-war person experiencing the post-war world for the first time, the Lone Wanderer is a Vault-born person encountering the outside world with essentially no prior experience of it. Every relationship they build, every piece of knowledge they gain, every value they develop emerges from the process of discovery that the game documents. This makes them, in some ways, the purest expression of the Fallout premise. A person stepping out of a controlled past into an uncontrolled present, carrying only what the Vault gave them, finding out what that is worth. Part 7 Fallout New Vegas, 18 months, and a masterpiece. Fact 63. Obsidian Entertainment was given exactly 18 months to develop Fallout New Vegas. To appreciate what that means, New Vegas is an open-world RPG with a massive map, dozens of hours of main story content, hundreds of side quests, 6 companion characters with individual quest lines and companion arcs, a faction system of considerable complexity, a post-game designed to reflect the consequences of everything the player did, and one of the most praised pieces of writing in the franchise's history. All of that, in 18 months, Josh Sawyer, who directed the project, has said that the studio knew from the beginning that the deadline would define everything they could and could not do. The response was pragmatic. Reuse as much of Fallout 3's engine and asset library as possible, and spend the saved time on what Obsidian did best: writing, quest design, faction complexity, moral ambiguity. It worked. Fact 64. Obsidian's unfamiliarity with the Gamebryo engine, which Bethesda had used for Fallout 3, and which Obsidian had never worked with before, caused significant technical difficulties throughout New Vegas's development. One specific challenge shaped one of the game's most notable design features. Early builds had the New Vegas Strip as a single continuous area, open and walkable, populated densely with NPCs and lit by the neon of the casinos. The performance on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 hardware was unacceptable. The solution was to divide the strip into 3 sections separated by loading screens and reduce the NPC count substantially. Players who have seen pre-release footage of the strip know what was sacrificed. The gated, relatively sparse strip in the final game is a compromise born from hardware constraints and an 18-month timeline, not a creative preference. Fact 65. Josh Sawyer used satellite data from the United States Geological Survey and his own reference photographs of the actual Mojave Desert to design the game's map. The terrain, vegetation, geological features, and relationships between landmarks are informed by real geography. The Hoover Dam sits approximately where it actually is. Red Rock Canyon is in the right general location. The highway route between Good Springs and New Vegas traces real roads. This geographic fidelity gives the Mojave Wasteland a quality of place that purely invented settings cannot achieve the specific texture of the real desert. Its scale and emptiness and particular quality of light comes through in the design. Fact 66. New Vegas's faction system is widely considered the most sophisticated in the franchise's history, designed with a specific philosophical commitment to refusing the player an obvious moral choice. The New California Republic is democratic, expansionist, and increasingly corrupt a civilization that has reproduced the dysfunction of the pre-war United States while trying to move beyond what caused the war. Caesar's Legion is brutal and totalitarian and effective, having created genuine order and stability at the cost of individual rights and the perpetuation of slavery. Mr. House is an autocrat with a coherent long-term plan for humanity that requires no input from the humans it affects. The independent option gives the player control of New Vegas while leaving it without protection. Josh Sawyer designed each faction to be genuinely defensible and genuinely criticizable. You can make a reasonable argument for any of them, and reasonable people will make different arguments. That was the point. Fact 67. One of New Vegas's most beloved companions is Raul Tejada, an elderly Mexican ghoul who was a young man when the bombs fell in 2077, making him the better part of 2 centuries old by the time the player meets him. He was in Mexico City during the Great War. He survived by hiding in a grocery store. He has lived through everything that followed and kept going not because he had a reason, but because he did not know what else to do. His companion quest, Old School Ghoul, asks whether old people in the wasteland can still contribute meaningfully, whether age and accumulated experience have value in a world defined by violence and immediate survival. It is one of the more affecting pieces of writing in the franchise, treating its subject with the seriousness it deserves. Fact 68. Benny, the dapper gangster who opens New Vegas by shooting the courier in the head and leaving them in a shallow grave, was voiced by the late Matthew Perry. Perry brought to the role a quality of smooth, slightly desperate charm, the voice of someone who believes absolutely in his own cleverness and his own destiny, with no idea that destiny is much less interested in him than he is. Perry's voice work was delivered before his personal struggles became publicly known, and the performance is simply good, precise comic timing applied to a genuinely threatening character. Benny's role in the game is relatively brief, but his presence is felt throughout as the player pursues him across the Mojave, and Perry's voice makes him feel like a real person rather than a plot device. Fact 69. New Vegas contains some of the franchise's most detailed and emotionally resonant companion writing. Cass Rose of Sharon Cassidy is a caravan trader who has lost her caravan to a corporate conspiracy and carries her grief in a specific and recognizable way. Through anger, through alcohol, through a sharp and occasionally self-destructive directness. EDE is a military Eyebot with no voice who communicates entirely through beeps and musical tones, and somehow manages to be one of the most affecting companion characters in the series through sound design alone. Lily is a Nightkin supermutant, a schizophrenic elderly woman whose granddaughter's memories persist in a mind damaged by prolonged use of a stealth device, who is both funny and heartbreaking simultaneously. The range of what the writers achieved with the companion characters in 18 months is one of the more remarkable creative achievements in the franchise. Fact 70. The post-game content originally planned for New Vegas quests and events that would have played out after the player completed the main story and the Battle of Hoover Dam was cut due to time constraints. Design, documentation, and surviving files suggest that Obsidian intended for the consequences of the player's faction choice to play out interactively after the dam battle, with NPCs commenting on the new power structure, specific locations changing, and a small set of quests available in the immediate aftermath. What players got instead was the outstanding post-credits slideshow narrated by Ron Perlman, which describes the fates of locations and characters based on player choices. The slideshow is excellent. The interactive post-game it replaced would have been better. The 18-month window was what it was. Fact 71. The 4 DLC expansions for New Vegas Dead Money, Honest Hearts, Old World Blues, and Lonesome Road are collectively among the best content the franchise has produced. Dead Money is a survival horror piece in which the player is stripped of equipment and must cooperate with reluctant companions to escape a pre-war resort hotel. Honest Hearts is a quieter meditation on culture and survival in a fictionalized Zion National Park. Old World Blues is a satirical comedy set in a facility staffed by disembodied brains in robot bodies, which manages to be both funnier and more emotionally affecting than its premise suggests it has any right to be. And Lonesome Road brings the courier face-to-face with Ulysses, the companion who was cut from the base game, in a confrontation that forces a reckoning with the courier's past actions and their consequences for a region the player may not have known existed. Fact 72. Fallout. New Vegas launched with significant bugs crashes, NPC pathfinding failures, quest-breaking glitches that affected the experience substantially enough to lower the game's review scores at launch. Over subsequent patches, the worst of these were addressed. And over the years since, as the bugs diminished and as the game's depth became better understood, critical opinion shifted. Many critics who reviewed New Vegas at launch have since written that they underrated it. The game has sold an estimated 11.6 million copies worldwide. The consensus now, among both critics and players, is that it represents the peak of the franchise in terms of writing, faction design, and moral complexity, a game made under impossible constraints that exceeded what should have been possible within them. Fact 73. The New California Republic, one of New Vegas's major factions, has its origins in Vault 15 and the small settlement of Shady Sands, both encountered in the original Fallout and Fallout 2. By 2281, the NCR has grown into the most powerful post-war nation on the West Coast, with functioning currency, a democratically elected government, a standing military capable of projecting force across hundreds of miles, and all the bureaucratic inertia and corruption that tends to develop when democratic institutions age. It is the franchise's most detailed exploration of what post-war civilization building actually looks like. Not idealized, not simply functional, but struggling with all the things that large democratic institutions struggle with, under conditions considerably more difficult than those the institutions were designed for. Fact 74. New Vegas contains individualized endings for nearly every significant location and character in the game, delivered through a post-credit slideshow narrated by Ron Perlman. These endings describe the consequences of the player's choices, not just for the Mojave's major factions, but for individual settlements, individual characters, individual groups of people whose futures were affected by what the player did or chose not to do. Players who have spent hundreds of hours in the game can still discover endings they were unaware of, slides for minor locations they never visited, characters they never spoke to. The completeness of this accounting of consequence is one of the franchise's most committed pieces of game design, and it represents New Vegas's faith in the idea that everything matters and everything has consequences. Part 8, Fallout 4 and the Commonwealth. Fact 75. Fallout 4 was announced at E3 in June 2015, just 5 months before its November release. The announcement came after 7 years of development. Bethesda began work on the game immediately after Fallout 3's release in 2008, and the gap had generated enormous anticipation. The reveal trailer opened with a domestic scene in pre-war Concord, Massachusetts, and then pulled back to reveal the same location 200 years later. Bombed out, gray, with a dog wandering through the rubble. The dog was still there. It was one of the more effective reveal trailers in gaming history, communicating setting, tone, and emotional stakes in under a minute, and generating immediate and intense discussion about everything the brief glimpse suggested about the game. Fact 76. The Commonwealth's Boston setting was by Bethesda's own accounts, the subject of genuine internal doubt during development. There was a period when Todd Howard and others seriously considered abandoning the location and starting over elsewhere. What ultimately persuaded the team to stay was the work that had already been done. The detailed geography of what had been a dense urban area, the specific history of Boston, the institute operating beneath the ruins of MIT, Diamond City inside Fenway Park, the colonial history layered beneath the post-apocalyptic present. Once the map was populated and the content began to fill in, the specificity of the setting proved harder to replicate with a hypothetical alternative. Boston stayed, and the Commonwealth's urban density, notably different from New Vegas's open desert or Fallout 3's DC suburbs, became one of the game's most distinctive design elements. Fact 77. The first asset created for Fallout 4 was the power armor. By Todd Howard's account, getting it right was his first and most personal priority before any other aspect of development was addressed. The power armor in Fallout 4 was redesigned more significantly than any previous entry had attempted. Rather than being armor worn over existing clothing, it became a full exoskeleton vehicle, something climbed into and operated, requiring fusion cores to power. This change was controversial among fans who preferred the traditional mechanics, but it gave the armor a physical presence and mechanical weight that felt appropriate for what it was supposed to represent. The redesign also informed how the game's opening sequence worked. The player's first encounter with power armor in Fallout 4 is designed to feel genuinely significant, and the suit you retrieve at the start of the game stays with you in a way that the armor in previous entries rarely did. Fact 78. Fallout 4's concept artwork and visual direction were significantly influenced by Adam Adamovicz, who had contributed to Fallout 3 and passed away from cancer in 2012 before Fallout 4 was completed. Adamowicz's work pushed the game toward more color. Todd Howard has acknowledged that Bethesda became too focused on browns and grays during Skyrim's development, and Fallout 4's brighter, more varied palette was partly a deliberate correction. Adamowicz's influence on the character creation system and on the general visual language of the Commonwealth is credited by colleagues as substantial. The game is, in some ways, a tribute to his vision, carrying forward choices he had argued for before his death. Fact 79. Fallout 4 was the first franchise entry to give the player character a fully voiced performance. Brian T. Delaney voiced the male sole survivor and Courtney Taylor the female. The decision was made to increase the cinematic quality of dialogue exchanges and create a more emotionally present player character during cutscenes. The trade-off always present when a previously silent protagonist acquires a voice was that the performance carries its own personality, which may not match the character a given player wants to inhabit. Todd Howard has since acknowledged that the dialogue approach was one of the areas of Fallout 4 that did not work as well as intended, and that future projects would be informed by this experience. Fact 80. The settlement building system in Fallout 4 was, according to the game's lead producer, the element of the game most likely to be cut during development. It required multiple complex systems to work in concert, and until relatively late in development, the team was not confident they could make it work well enough to ship. It divided the fan base significantly. Some players found it one of the most engaging aspects of the experience, a sandbox for creative expression within the Fallout universe, unlike anything any previous entry had offered. Others found it an unwelcome distraction from the RPG content that had always defined the franchise. Both responses were genuine, and both reflected something true about what Fallout 4 was trying to be. Fact 81. The Institute, Fallout 4's primary antagonist organization, is built beneath the ruins of MIT. Its stated mission is the preservation of knowledge and the development of technology in isolation from a surface world the Institute considers irredeemably compromised, with the eventual intention of emerging to rebuild civilization. On its own terms, the Institute creates synths, synthetic humans so convincingly biological that they are functionally indistinguishable from natural humans at the cellular level. The moral complexity of the Institute, whether they are simply villains or a group with deeply flawed methods and a coherent long-term vision, is one of Fallout 4's genuine contributions to the franchise's thematic landscape. The fact that the Institute is run by Father, who turns out to be the player's son grown old while the sole survivor was frozen, gives its philosophical arrogance a personal dimension that changes how every conversation with Institute representatives feels. Fact 82. Nick Valentine, the synth detective companion in Fallout 4, was designed to explore a specific question the game raises repeatedly. What is the relationship between a mind and the substrate it runs on? Valentine is a Generation 2 synth carrying the memories and personality of a pre-war detective, imprinted into a synthetic body decades after the original's death. He has those memories and that personality, and he has developed further since his creation, his own experiences, his own relationships, his own evolving sense of who he is. The game treats the question of whether he is Nick Valentine as genuinely open rather than resolved, refusing to answer it definitively on the player's behalf. Stephen Russell's voice performance gave Valentine a quality of weariness and warmth that made him feel like a complete person rather than a philosophical thought experiment in a trench coat. Fact 83. Far Harbor, the DLC expansion set on a fog-covered island off the coast of Maine, is widely regarded as the best content Fallout 4 produced. The island's atmosphere dense radioactive fog, a small community under constant existential threat, isolation that feels both physical and psychological, gives the expansion a texture unlike anything in the base game. The mystery at its center, concerning the identity and memories of a character named Kasumi Nakamura, is the franchise's most thoughtful exploration of synth identity. The island's factions, human settlers, children of Adam, and a synth community that has escaped the Institute have complex, interlocking relationships that reward patient engagement, and the expansion's possible resolutions range from genuinely hopeful to genuinely tragic, depending on what the player chooses to do. Fact 84. At the 2016 DICE Awards, Todd Howard mentioned that Fallout 4 contained secrets that players had not yet found, and that at least one of them involved a terminal somewhere in the Commonwealth. This statement sent players back into the game for fresh exploratory passes, looking in corners and behind terminals they might have walked past without reading. The idea that a game played by millions of people, with an active modding community that had examined much of the game's code directly, could still contain genuinely undiscovered content was both thrilling and slightly disorienting. It reflected how much work Bethesda had put into filling the Commonwealth, and how much of any open world simply goes unnoticed because there is more in it than any single player will ever see. Part 9, Fallout 76, The Amazon Show, and the franchise's present. Fact 85. Fallout 76, announced and released in 2018, was the franchise's first online multiplayer game, a departure from the single-player RPG format that had defined every previous entry. Set in West Virginia in 2102, just 25 years after the Great War, it is the earliest set mainline Fallout game and the first to explore the immediate post-war period. The setting was visually distinctive. Appalachian forests and mountains looked nothing like the desert of New Vegas or the bombed-out DC suburbs of Fallout 3. And the game's structural hook players emerging from Vault 76 as the first to attempt reclamation of the surface was sound in concept. The execution at launch was considerably more troubled. Fact 86. The most significant and most discussed issue with Fallout 76 at launch was the absence of human NPCs. The decision to populate Appalachia exclusively with robots and environmental storytelling was intended to create a specific atmosphere, a world genuinely waiting to be reclaimed, where the player characters would be the most significant human presences. What many players experienced was loneliness of the wrong kind, an open world with no characters to speak with in a franchise built on the richness of human interaction. The holotapes were well written and the environmental storytelling was impressive in places. But the structural absence of living people to talk to affected the experience in ways Bethesda had not fully anticipated. Fact 87. The Wastelanders update, released in April 2020, addressed the NPC problem directly. It introduced two major human factions to Appalachia settlers who had come from outside the region, and raiders who had organized into competing political structures, along with a complete new main questline, two companion characters with full arcs, thousands of new dialogue lines, and the general sense that Appalachia had become a place where human civilization was genuinely attempting to reassemble itself. The response was significantly more positive than the original launch had received, and it marked the beginning of a sustained improvement in Fallout 76's reputation. The game has continued to receive major updates since then, each expanding the world substantially. Fact 88. The Amazon Prime Fallout television series, which premiered on the 10th of April 2024, was developed by Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy, the creators of Westworld, in collaboration with Bethesda, with Todd Howard as executive producer. The decision to set the show within the game's canonical universe, rather than as a separate adaptation, shaped every creative decision. The show had to be coherent with established lore, had to feature elements recognizable from the games without simply recreating game scenarios, and had to work for viewers who had never played Fallout alongside those who had hundreds of hours in the franchise. It broke Amazon Prime Video's opening viewership records in the United States. It generated enormous renewed interest in the games. Fallout 4's player numbers on Steam spiked dramatically in the days immediately following its premiere. Fact 89. The most discussed piece of new canon introduced by the television series is the implication that Vault-Tec actively initiated the Great War. The show depicts a meeting of major pre-war corporations in which Vault-Tec's representatives propose proactively triggering the nuclear exchange, rather than simply preparing for it, to ensure that Vault-Tec's shelters would be the dominant post-war power. The games had always left the question of who fired first deliberately ambiguous. The show made a specific choice. Todd Howard has confirmed that the show is canonical, which means this piece of backstory is now officially part of Fallout's history. The response among fans has been mixed admiration for the boldness of the choice, skepticism about its consistency with other established details, and the debate about it is ongoing. Fact 90. The production design of the Fallout television series was remarkable in its fidelity to the game's visual language. The Pip-Boy props used by the actors were practical effects they actually illuminated and displayed information through internal electronics, rather than being blank props with screens added in post-production. The power armor suits worn by Brotherhood of Steel Knights were full, practical costumes, requiring multiple crew members to assemble around the wearer and severely limiting the actor's visibility. The wasteland environments were constructed with care to replicate the specific texture of Fallout's aesthetic. The particular combination of mid-century Americana and post-apocalyptic ruin, the Vault-Tec logos, the Nuka-Cola bottles, the chrome, and the rubble. Viewers who had spent thousands of hours in the games reported experiencing recognition that felt almost physical when familiar elements appeared on screen. Fact 91. Season 2 of the Fallout television series was confirmed before the first season had finished its opening weekend. The viewership numbers and critical response were strong enough that Amazon did not wait for complete data before ordering more. Season 2 was filmed in and around New Mexico and confirmed to be set partly in the New Vegas area, bringing the show into direct dialogue with the most beloved of the modern Fallout games. Todd Howard confirmed the new California Republic would feature prominently. The prospect of the show depicting the Mojave and the NCR on television generated anticipation among fans who had been waiting to see what New Vegas would look like rendered at this production scale. Fact 92. Fallout Shelter, the mobile game released simultaneously with Fallout 4's announcement at E3 2015, was available to download on iOS devices the same day. It was revealed an unusual release strategy that caught the gaming press completely off guard. The game is a resource management simulation in which players run their own vault, assigning dwellers to rooms, managing their needs, defending against threats, and sending them into the wasteland for supplies and missions. It was downloaded over 100 million times in its first year and represents the franchise's most commercially successful expansion into mobile gaming. Its design ingeniously inverted the franchise's usual perspective. Instead of playing as a dweller escaping the vault, you play as the system that manages everything inside it. Fact 93. The Fallout franchise has, across its history, generated one of gaming's most active and creative fan communities. The modding community for New Vegas in particular has produced work of extraordinary ambition standalone prequel mods, large-scale expansions, total conversions, and hundreds of smaller refinements that together demonstrate the depth of engagement the game inspires. The Fallout Wiki, a collaborative fan resource, contains millions of words documenting the franchise's lore, history, and game mechanics across every entry. The cosplay community produces armor and outfit recreations of remarkable quality. Fan art, fan fiction, and fan analysis fill corners of the internet that the franchise would not have reached through official channels alone. The Fallout universe has been expanded, interpreted, and cherished by people who love it in ways that no official release could fully account for. Part 10: Easter eggs, hidden details, and developer secrets. Fact 94. The original Fallout is dense with embedded references to its own development team, subtle enough that most players would never notice them. The Fargo Traders, a merchant organization in the hub, are named as a reference to Brian Fargo, Interplay's founder. Certain psychic characters have dialogue that references Jason Anderson by name. The town of Shady Sands was placed and named partly in homage to the kind of optimistic, small-scale community building the team wanted to represent as a genuine possible outcome in the wasteland, a counterweight to the bleakness that dominates so much of the setting. The developers left their marks throughout the world in small ways that the game never explains, because the world did not need to explain them. They were gifts for people who already knew who to look for. Fact 95. Fallout 3's Mr. Gutsy robots have combat dialogue dense with film references. Their most frequently cited line is a direct rephrasing of a Robert Duvall speech from Apocalypse Now. "There is nothing I like better than the smell of plasma in the morning," substituting plasma for napalm. The robots also contain extensive references to Full Metal Jacket, specifically to the film's first act and the character of Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. Giving military robots dialogue drawn from films about Vietnam and military culture, about the dehumanization of soldiers, the absurdity of institutional violence is characteristic of the franchise's approach, presenting dark material through comedy that makes it more bearable without making it less real. Fact 96. New Vegas contains Vault 34, which explores what happens when a community's ability to make decisions is corrupted by the very resource it needs to protect. The Vault was equipped with a significant oversupply of weapons and ammunition, with access tightly controlled by the Overseer. Resentment of this control eventually produced open conflict. The Vault now houses the Boomer survivors who escaped before the full violence erupted, and is otherwise a radioactive ruin populated by feral ghouls, the descendants of those who did not. The history of Vault 34 can be reconstructed from the evidence left behind by people who did not survive to see anyone find it, which is the specific and particular quality of Fallout's best environmental storytelling. Fact 97. Vault 11's final audio log is delivered by the Vault's automated systems in the sacrificial chamber. The log was always intended to be played only when a population finally refused to comply with the annual sacrifice requirement. It thanks them. It tells them the experiment has reached its conclusion. It informs them that the execution protocol will not be carried out. Their refusal was precisely what the experiment was designed to find: evidence that humans would, under sufficient pressure, eventually refuse an immoral directive. The 5 survivors heard this message. They had complied with the sacrifice requirement for years before finally refusing. They processed what they had done and what they had been a part of, and they killed themselves. The Vault's experiment found what it was looking for. The finding destroyed the people who provided it. Fact 98. The Fallout franchise contains an unusual amount of what fans call hidden lore, pieces of history and story communicated not through explicit narrative, but through the patient accumulation of environmental details, holotape recordings, terminal entries, and the connections between them. This approach was deliberate from the beginning. The team behind the original game believed a post-apocalyptic world should have a history deeper than what the player could directly access, and that curious players who looked would find that depth waiting for them. The most sophisticated pieces of hidden lore require visiting multiple locations, reading multiple texts, and making connections between information the game never explicitly links. The communities that have grown around Fallout are substantially devoted to this kind of archaeology, finding the pieces, working out what they mean when assembled. Fact 99. The glowing sea in Fallout 4, the region of extreme radiation in the Commonwealth's southwestern corner, the impact site of the bomb that struck Boston directly in 2077, is one of the game's most hostile and most carefully constructed environments. Deathclaws, rad scorpions, feral ghouls, and extreme radiation make sustained exploration genuinely dangerous. The sky is permanently overcast and a sick orange-gray. The ground is bare of everything except twisted concrete and rusting metal, and Bethesda filled it with content: small camps, pre-war remnants, characters with their own stories, at least one location significant to the main quest. The design philosophy is consistent with the franchise's approach. The most hostile places should also be the most rewarding to explore, because difficulty and reward should scale together. The glowing sea rewards players who push through the danger and look. Fact 100. The Enclave is the franchise's most persistent recurring antagonist faction, and understanding what they represent makes them more effective villains than any amount of surface menace could. The Enclave is what remains of the pre-war United States government, specifically the parts that survived because they were hidden before the bombs fell. They believe themselves to be the legitimate heirs of American civilization, the true government of a nation that has temporarily ceased to exist. Their plan for restoring that nation requires the elimination of everyone who was exposed to radiation and survived, which in the wasteland means essentially everyone. The horror of this is not in the scale of what they're proposing. It is in the sincerity with which they believe it is justified. They are not simply evil. They are the logical endpoint of a nationalism separated from any actual nation and the people who might constitute it. Fact 101. The last thing worth saying about Fallout, after 100 facts about its history and its secrets, is perhaps the simplest. The reason this franchise has endured across nearly 3 decades, from a nearly canceled side project made by 30 people to a global media property with games, a television series, merchandise, and millions of devoted fans is not the combat systems, or the open-world design, or the post-apocalyptic setting, though all of these have been done well and sometimes brilliantly. It is the specific feeling the games produce when you step out of shelter into the wasteland for the first time. That moment emerging from Vault 13, from Vault 101, from Vault 111, from Vault 76 when the sky opens above you and the world opens ahead, vast and ruined and full of possibility, and you understand that what happens from here is a consequence of what you choose to do. The wasteland is never simply destruction. It is also always a place where things are being rebuilt. Imperfectly, under difficult conditions, by people who are making do with what remains. Communities form, friendships develop, civilizations argue about their shape. The questions that define us as a species, what is worth preserving, what needs to change, what we owe to each other, are being asked and answered and asked again every day in the wreckage. That is why there is still a fallout. That is why there will likely always be one. War never changes, but the stories people tell about what they hope for in the silence after the fighting stops, those keep changing, and that makes all the difference. If you made it all the way through this one, thank you. There is something genuinely wonderful about spending a few hours in the wasteland without any of the danger. Hit the like button if these facts landed well for you, subscribe if you want to be here for whatever comes next, and drop a comment before you fall asleep. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, and which of these 101 facts surprised you most. I read every single one. Sleep well out there. Who have seen pre-release footage know what was sacrificed. Fact 65. Josh Sawyer used satellite data from the United States Geological Survey and his own reference photographs of the actual Mojave Desert to design the game's geographic layout. The terrain, vegetation, geological features, and landmark relationships are all informed by real geography. The Hoover Dam sits approximately where it actually is. Red Rock Canyon is in the right general location. The highway route between Good Springs and New Vegas traces real roads. This geographic fidelity gives the Mojave Wasteland a quality of place that purely invented settings cannot achieve. The specific scale and emptiness and quality of light that makes the real Mojave what it is comes through in the design. Fact 66. New Vegas's faction system is widely considered the most sophisticated the franchise has produced, designed with a specific philosophical commitment to denying the player an obvious moral choice. The NCR is democratic, expansionist, increasingly corrupt a civilization that has reproduced the dysfunction of the pre-war United States while attempting to move beyond what caused the war. Caesar's Legion is brutal, totalitarian, and effective, having created genuine stability at the cost of individual rights and perpetual slavery. Mr. House is an autocrat with a coherent long-term vision for humanity's future that requires no input from the humans it affects. The independent option gives control of New Vegas without providing the infrastructure that control requires to be sustainable. Sawyer designed each faction to be genuinely defensible and genuinely criticizable. You can make a reasonable argument for any of them. The argument is ongoing because that was the design intent. Fact 67. Among New Vegas's most affecting companions is Raul Alfonso Tejada, an elderly Mexican ghoul who was a young man when the bombs fell in 2077, making him the better part of 2 centuries old when the player meets him. He was in Mexico City during the Great War. He survived by hiding in a grocery store. He has lived through everything that followed and kept going not because he had a reason, but because he did not know what else to do. His companion quest, Old School Ghoul, asks whether old age in the wasteland carries legitimate claim to continued relevance, whether accumulated experience and long perspective have value in a world rewarding immediate physical capability. It is one of the more affecting pieces of writing in the franchise, treating its subject with seriousness it deserves. Fact 68. Benny, the dapper gangster who opens New Vegas by shooting the courier in the head and leaving them in a shallow grave, was voiced by the late Matthew Perry. Perry brought to the role a quality of smooth, slightly brittle charm, the voice of someone who absolutely believes in his own cleverness and destiny, who has organized his entire life around the story he tells himself about who he is, and who has had no serious occasion yet to doubt that story. His ability to make Benny simultaneously threatening and slightly ridiculous is central to the character's effectiveness. Perry's voice makes Benny feel like a complete person rather than a plot mechanism. Fact 69. New Vegas contains some of the franchise's most richly developed companion writing. EDE, a military Eyebot, has no voice and communicates entirely through electronic tones, and is somehow one of the most emotionally affecting companions through nothing but sound design and the reactions of others. Cass is a caravan trader who has lost everything and carries her grief through anger, alcohol, and a self-destructive directness. Lily is a Nightkin supermutant whose schizophrenia has preserved the personality of an elderly grandmother in a body designed for violence, both funny and heartbreaking simultaneously. The range of what the New Vegas writers achieved with these characters in an 18-month development window is one of the more quietly remarkable creative accomplishments in franchise history. Fact 70. The post-game content originally planned for New Vegas, an extended interactive section allowing players to experience the consequences of their faction choices playing out in real time after the Battle of Hoover Dam, was cut due to time constraints. Design documentation suggests Obsidian intended for NPCs to react dynamically to which faction had won, for locations to change to reflect the winner's control, and for a small set of immediate post-battle quests to be available. What players received instead was the outstanding post-credit slideshow narrated by Ron Perlman. It is an excellent piece of writing. The interactive post-game it replaced would have been something else entirely. Fact 71. New Vegas's 4 DLC expansions are, taken together, among the best content the franchise has ever produced. Dead Money strips the player of equipment and forces survival through cooperation in a pre-war casino resort, achieving sustained atmospheric horror with a genuinely affecting conclusion. Honest Hearts examines what it means to protect a culture that cannot protect itself, centered on Joshua Graham and the question of how to balance mercy with justice. Old World Blues sends the player to a facility staffed by disembodied brains in robot bodies, performing surreal science with cheerful incompetence. Both the franchise's funniest content and one of its more affecting explorations of memory and loss. Lonesome Road forces a confrontation with Ulysses, the companion cut from the base game, and with the consequences of the courier's past. Fact 72. New Vegas launched with significant bugs, crashes, quest-breaking glitches, NPC pathfinding failures. Review scores reflected this, with several publications rating the game below Fallout 3, partly on the basis of technical state at launch. Over subsequent patches and years, as the bugs diminished and the game's depth became better understood, critical opinion shifted dramatically. Many critics who reviewed it at launch have since written that they underrated it. The game has sold an estimated 11.6 million copies worldwide. It is now widely regarded as the franchise's creative peak in terms of writing, faction design, and moral complexity, a game made under impossible constraints that exceeded what should have been possible within them. Fact 73. The New California Republic's history in the franchise extends back to the original Fallout, where the player encounters the earliest stages of what would become the NCR in Shady Sands and Vault 15. By 2281, the Republic has grown into the most powerful post-war nation on the West Coast, a functioning democracy with elected representatives, a standing military capable of projecting force across hundreds of miles, and all the attendant bureaucratic dysfunction and political corruption that large democratic governments develop as they age. The NCR is the franchise's most detailed exploration of what post-war civilization building actually looks like, not idealized, not simplified, but struggling with all the things that large democratic institutions struggle with under conditions they were not designed for. Fact 74. New Vegas contains personalized ending slides for nearly every significant location, faction, and character in the game, delivered through a post-credits narrated sequence summarizing the consequences of the player's choices. The number of distinct possible slides and the specificity of the conditions that trigger them is extraordinary. The franchise had never before attempted to document player choice consequences at this level of granularity and has not quite matched it since. Players who have spent hundreds of hours in the Mojave can still discover ending slides for locations or characters they had missed. The completeness of this accounting of consequence is the franchise's most committed expression of its central belief, that everything you do has consequences, and those consequences extend further than you realized while making the choices. Part 8. Fallout 4 and the Commonwealth. Fact 75. Fallout 4 was announced at E3 in June 2015, 5 months before its November release, an unusually compressed marketing window, reflecting Bethesda's preference since the mid-2010s for shorter gaps between announcement and availability. The reveal trailer opened in a domestic pre-war scene in Sanctuary Hills, Massachusetts, then pulled back to reveal the same location 200 years later, bombed out, gray, with a dog wandering through the rubble still there, aged and scarred, waiting in what remained. As a piece of game marketing, it accomplished something reveal trailers rarely do, communicating setting, tone, emotional stakes, and central thematic preoccupation in approximately 90 seconds, without telling you anything about the plot or mechanics. Fact 76. The Commonwealth's Boston setting was, by Bethesda's own accounts, the subject of genuine internal doubt during development. There was a point at which Todd Howard and others seriously considered abandoning the location entirely. What convinced them to stay was the work already done. The detailed geography, the specific history of Boston, the MIT-derived institute operating beneath Cambridge, Diamond City inside Fenway Park, the colonial history layered beneath the post-apocalyptic present. Once the map was populated with this content, the case for a different location became harder to make. The Commonwealth's urban density, denser and more vertical than any previous Fallout setting, became one of the game's most distinctive design elements. Fact 77. The first asset created for Fallout 4 was the power armor. By Todd Howard's account, getting it right was his first and most personal priority before any other aspect of development. The power armor in Fallout 4 was redesigned more significantly than any previous entry had attempted, from armor worn over existing clothing to a full exoskeleton vehicle that required fusion cores to power, that the player climbed into rather than simply equipped. This change was controversial among fans who preferred traditional mechanics, but it gave the armor a physical presence and mechanical weight appropriate for what it represented. The redesign also informed the game's opening sequence. The player's first encounter with power armor in Fallout 4 is designed to feel genuinely significant, and the suit you retrieve at the start stays with you in a way that armor in previous entries rarely did. Fact 78. Fallout 4's visual direction was significantly shaped by Adam Adamowicz, who contributed to both Fallout 3 and early Fallout 4 development before his death from cancer in 2012. Adamowicz's work pushed consistently toward more color and visual variety, arguing against the tendency toward brown and gray palettes that had characterized Bethesda's development during the Skyrim period. Todd Howard has acknowledged this tendency as something the studio recognized as a habit to correct. Adamowicz's influence on the character creation system, the visual language of Commonwealth settlements, and the general aesthetic direction of the game is credited by colleagues as substantial. The game serves in part as a tribute to his vision. Fact 79. Fallout 4 was the first franchise entry to give the player character a fully voiced performance, with Brian T. Delaney voicing the male sole survivor and Courtney Taylor the female. The decision was driven by the desire for more cinematically present dialogue exchanges. The trade-off always present when a previously silent protagonist acquires a voice is that the performance carries its own personality, which may not match what any given player wants to project onto the character. Todd Howard has since acknowledged that the dialogue approach was one of the areas of Fallout 4 that did not work as well as intended, and that future projects would be informed by this experience. Fact 80. The settlement building system in Fallout 4 was, according to the lead producer, the element most likely to be cut during development. It required multiple complex systems to work simultaneously in ways that proved difficult to achieve. It divided the fan base. Some players found it one of the most engaging aspects, a creative sandbox for expression within the Fallout universe, unlike anything previous entries had offered. Others found it a distraction from the RPG core. Both responses were genuine, and both reflected something true about what Fallout 4 was attempting to be and what it became at the cost of being. Fact 81. The Institute in Fallout 4 is built beneath the ruins of MIT. Its mission is the preservation of knowledge and development of technology in isolation from a surface world the Institute considers irredeemably compromised, with the eventual intention of reshaping civilization according to its accumulated values. The synths it creates, synthetic humans indistinguishable from natural ones at the cellular level, are the most advanced technology in the franchise's universe. The moral complexity of the Institute, whether they are simply villains or a group with deeply flawed methods and a coherent long-term vision, is one of Fallout 4's genuine contributions to the franchise's thematic landscape. That the Institute is run by Father, who turns out to be the player's son grown old while the sole survivor was frozen, gives its philosophical arrogance a personal dimension that changes every conversation with its representatives. Fact 82. Nick Valentine, the synth detective companion in Fallout 4, was designed to explore what the game's central question about synth identity means at a personal level. Valentine is a Generation 2 synth carrying the memories and personality of a pre-war Boston detective, imprinted into a synthetic body decades after the original's death. He has those memories and that personality, and he has continued to develop beyond them, building new relationships, accumulating new experiences, becoming something continuous with the pre-war Nick Valentine in some ways, and entirely its own thing in others. The game treats the question of whether he is Nick Valentine as genuinely open and genuinely important, refusing to resolve it. Stephen Russell's performance gave Valentine a quality of weariness and warmth that made him feel like a complete person rather than a philosophical thought experiment in a trench coat. Fact 83. Far Harbor, the DLC expansion set on a fog-covered island off the coast of Maine, is widely regarded as the best content Fallout 4 produced. The island's dense radioactive fog creates a physical constraint on movement and perception that generates sustained tension. The three factions, human settlers, a Children of Atom colony, and a synth community called Acadia, have complex interdependent relationships the player must navigate carefully. The mystery at the center, concerning the identity and memories of a character named Kasumi Nakamura, is the franchise's most nuanced exploration of synth identity, and its possible resolutions range from genuinely hopeful to genuinely tragic, depending on what the player understands and chooses. Fact 84. At the 2016 DICE Awards, Todd Howard mentioned that Fallout 4 contained undiscovered secrets, including at least one on a terminal somewhere in the Commonwealth. This statement sent players back into the game for renewed exploratory passes through locations they believed they had thoroughly examined. The idea that a game played by millions, with an active modding community that had examined much of its data directly, could still contain genuinely undiscovered content felt improbable and genuinely exciting. It reflected the density of detail Bethesda had invested in filling the Commonwealth and reminded players that in any sufficiently large open world, there is always more than any individual will see. Part 9 Fallout 76, The Amazon Show, and the franchise's present. Fact 85. Fallout 76, released in November 2018, was the franchise's first online multiplayer game and its first to explore the immediate post-war period set in 2102, just 25 years after the Great War, In West Virginia's Appalachian region, the setting was visually distinctive, forests and mountains rather than desert, a landscape that felt more densely and immediately natural than the urban ruins of previous games. The structural concept players emerging from Vault 76 as the first reclamation effort, finding a world not yet shaped by post-war civilization, was sound. The execution at launch was considerably more troubled than the concept had been. Fact 86. The most significant and most discussed issue with Fallout 76 at launch was the absence of human NPCs. The decision to populate Appalachia exclusively with robots, automated systems, and the recorded voices of the dead was intended to create a specific atmosphere, a world genuinely waiting for reclamation. What many players experienced instead was solitude of the wrong kind, an open world with no living people to interact with in a franchise fundamentally built around human interaction. The holotapes were well written. The absence of living NPCs affected the experience in ways Bethesda's post-launch response acknowledged directly. Fact 87. The Wastelanders update, released in April 2020, introduced two major human factions to Appalachia with their own political agendas, two companion characters with full quest arcs and voiced performances, thousands of new dialogue lines, and a complete new main quest line. The response was substantially more positive than the original launch reception. Bethesda has continued updating the game with major content additions since then, new regions, storylines, and systems, each expanding what the original game offered. Fallout 76 today is a substantially different game from what shipped in 2018. Fact 88. The Amazon Prime Fallout television series premiered on the 10th of April 2024, developed by Jonathan Nolan and Lisa Joy with Todd Howard as executive producer. The decision to set the show within the canonical game universe, rather than as a separate adaptation, required the show to be coherent with established lore, while telling a story that worked for audiences who had never played Fallout. It broke Amazon Prime Video's opening viewership records in the United States. In the days following its premiere, the number of concurrent players in Fallout 4 on Steam increased by over 1,000% compared to normal baseline figures. Fact 89. The most discussed piece of new canonical material from the television series is the implication that Vault-Tec actively initiated the Great War, that the nuclear exchange of 2077 was a deliberate act by a corporation, seeking to ensure the post-war world would be organized around its own power. The games had always left the question of who fired first deliberately ambiguous. The show made a specific choice. Todd Howard confirmed the series is canonical. The response has been complex. Some players find the revelation an appropriately dark culmination of everything the franchise has said about corporate power and catastrophe. Others find it inconsistent with game implications or too explicit for a mystery they preferred to remain open. Fact 90. The production design of the Fallout television series reflects an unusual commitment to physical practical effects. The Pip-Boy props were built with working internal electronics they illuminated, and displayed information rather than being blank props, with screens composited in post-production. The power armor suits were full physical costumes requiring multiple crew members to help wearers put on, severely limiting visibility during filming. The care taken with these effects reflected a recognition that Fallout's aesthetic is not simply visual references, but a lived texture of specific objects and materials, and that getting it right required having the real thing on screen rather than approximating it digitally. Fact 91. Season 2 of the Fallout television series was commissioned before the end of the first season's opening weekend. Season 2 filmed in locations around New Mexico and was confirmed to be set partly in the New Vegas area, significant because New Vegas's Mojave setting is the most beloved by a substantial portion of the fan base, and because the first season's finale established consequences requiring engagement with New California Republic territory. The prospect of the show depicting the NCR and the Mojave at this production scale has generated considerable anticipation. Fact 92. Fallout Shelter, released simultaneously with Fallout 4's announcement at E3 2015, was available to download on the same day. It was revealed an unusual release strategy that caught the gaming press completely off guard. The mobile game is a resource management simulation in which players run their own vault, assigning dwellers to roles, managing their needs, defending against raids, and sending residents into the wasteland. Downloaded over 100 million times in its first year, it represents the franchise's most commercially successful mobile expansion. The design was elegant. By inverting the franchise's usual perspective, playing the Vault's management systems rather than one of its dwellers, it found a fresh angle on the setting, without departing from what makes it distinctive. Fact 93. The Fallout franchise has generated one of gaming's most active, creative, and long-standing fan communities, contributing to the franchise's cultural longevity in ways that go well beyond passive enthusiasm. The modding community for New Vegas has produced work of extraordinary ambition: standalone total conversions, large-scale content expansions, quality-of-life improvements that address rough edges without altering what made the game special. The Fallout Wiki contains millions of words of collaborative documentation. The cosplay community produces armor and outfit recreations of remarkable fidelity. Fan art, analysis, and fiction fill corners of the internet the franchise could not have reached through official channels alone. The world of Fallout exists in two places simultaneously: in the games themselves and in the sustained imaginative engagement of the people who love them. Part 10: Easter eggs, hidden details, and developer secrets. Fact 94. The original Fallout is dense with embedded references to its own development team. The Fargo Traders, a merchant operation in the hub, are named as a reference to Brian Fargo. Certain psychic characters have dialogue that references Jason Anderson and Leonard Boyarsky by name. The tradition of embedding developer references in ways that function as in-jokes for the team and quiet Easter eggs for anyone who looks became a consistent feature of the franchise across multiple studios and decades. It reflects something about the culture that built Fallout: people who considered themselves part of the game they were making, not just producing it. Fact 95. Fallout 3's Mr. Gutsy robots have combat dialogue dense with film references. Their most cited line, "There is nothing I like better than the smell of plasma in the morning," is a direct structural echo of Robert Duvall's speech in Apocalypse Now, substituting plasma for napalm while preserving the rhythm and self-congratulatory military bravado. The robots also draw extensively from Full Metal Jacket, specifically from Gunnery Sergeant Hartman's training monologues. Giving automated military hardware this specific intertextual background drawing from two of the most critically significant American films about Vietnam and military culture is characteristic of how Fallout presents dark material through comedy that makes it legible without making it less real or less pointed. Fact 96. Vault 34 in New Vegas explores what happens when a community's capacity for collective decision-making is corrupted by the very resource it needs to protect. The Vault was equipped with a substantial oversupply of weapons and ammunition, with access tightly controlled by the Overseer. Resentment eventually produced open conflict. The Vault now houses the Boomers' survivors who escaped before the worst violence, and is otherwise a radioactive ruin populated by feral ghouls and the accumulated environmental evidence of what happened to a community whose foundational dispute could not be resolved. Fact 97. Vault 11's final audio log is the most devastating payoff in the franchise's history of environmental storytelling. The log was recorded by the Vault's automated systems, intended to be played in the sacrificial chamber when and only when a population finally refused to comply. It thanks the survivors. It tells them the experiment is complete. It explains with the specific callousness of a system that does not understand why this information might be difficult to receive that their refusal was the experiment's goal, evidence that humans would eventually refuse an immoral directive. The 5 people who hear this message have watched friends and enemies be sacrificed for years, learning that all of it was designed, that the system had been killing people specifically to find the moment someone would say no, they do not survive the knowledge. The experiment found its answer. The finding destroyed the people who provided it. Fact 98. The Fallout franchise contains a category of storytelling critics and fans call hidden lore pieces of the world's history delivered not through explicit narrative, but through the patient accumulation of holotape, recordings, terminal entries, environmental arrangements, and the connections between them the game never explicitly draws. This approach was built into the franchise's design philosophy from the beginning, reflecting the belief that a post-apocalyptic world should have history deeper than what any individual player can access, and that curious players who look should find real history waiting. The most sophisticated hidden lore requires visiting multiple locations, reading multiple documents, making connections between information the game never explicitly links. The communities that have grown around Fallout are substantially devoted to this archaeological work, finding the pieces, assembling their significance, sharing the picture with people who missed a necessary component. Fact 99. The glowing sea in Fallout 4, the region of extreme radiation in the Commonwealth's southwestern corner, the direct impact site of the warhead that struck Boston in 2077, is one of the most hostile environments in the game, and one of the most carefully and densely stocked. The permanent overcast sky, the sick orange-gray light, the extreme radiation levels that kill unprotected players within minutes, all create an environment the game discourages casual exploration of. Bethesda filled that environment with content anyway. Discoverable sites, characters with their own stories, quest-relevant locations, pieces of Commonwealth history findable only by players willing to push through the danger. The design philosophy is consistent with the franchise's broader values. The most hostile and difficult places should also be the most rewarding, because difficulty and reward should scale together. Fact 100. The Enclave is the franchise's most persistent recurring villain faction, and understanding what they represent makes them more effective than any amount of surface menace could. The Enclave is what remains of the pre-war United States government, the elements that survived because they were hidden and protected before the bombs fell. They believe themselves the legitimate heirs of American civilization, the true government of a nation that has temporarily ceased to exist. Their plan for restoring that nation requires the elimination of everyone exposed to radiation and survived, which, in the wasteland, means essentially everyone. The horror is not in the scale of what they're proposing, but in the sincerity with which they believe it is justified. They are not simply evil. They are the logical endpoint of a nationalism separated from any actual nation and from any genuine relationship with the people that nation might have contained. Fact 101. The last thing worth saying about Fallout, after 100 facts about its history and its secrets, is perhaps the simplest. The reason this franchise has survived and grown across nearly 3 decades, from a nearly canceled side project made by 30 people to a global media property with games, a television series, merchandise, and millions of devoted fans is not any single mechanical system or aesthetic choice or piece of narrative design, though all of these have been done well and sometimes brilliantly. It is the specific feeling the games create when you first step out of shelter and into the wasteland. That moment emerging from Vault 13, from Vault 101, from Vault 111, from Vault 76, when the sky opens above you and the world opens ahead, vast and ruined and full of possibility, and you understand that everything from here is a consequence of what you choose to do. The wasteland is never simply destruction. It is always also a space where things are being rebuilt, imperfectly, under difficult conditions, by people making do with what remains. Communities form, relationships develop. Civilizations argue about their shape and their values and their futures. The questions that define human life, what is worth preserving, what needs to change, what we owe to each other are being asked and asked again every day in the rubble. That is why Fallout exists. That is why it persists. War never changes. But the stories people tell about what they hope might come after it keep changing. And that makes all the difference. If you made it all the way through this one, thank you. There is something that feels genuinely right about spending a few hours in the wasteland without any of the danger. Hit the like button if these facts landed for you, subscribe if you want to be here for whatever comes next, and drop a comment before you fall asleep. Tell me where in the world you're watching from, and which of these 101 facts surprised you most. I read every single one. Sleep well. Supplemental deep dives. Going deeper into the wasteland. The following are extended explorations of some of the franchise's most fascinating corners. Consider these a second pass through the wasteland, covering territory we've touched on with additional depth, on the design of consequence. One of the things that distinguishes Fallout from many of its contemporaries and many of its successors is the specific way it handles the concept of consequence. The franchise has never been interested in making the player feel judged. It has always been interested in making the player feel watched by the world, by the factions, by the NPCs who remember what you did to their friends and neighbors. This distinction sounds small but produces dramatically different games. A game that judges you through mechanics tells you what the right answer was. A game that makes the world remember creates situations where there may not be a single right answer, only a series of choices whose implications you discover after making them. The moral grayness that Tim Kaine and the original Fallout team built into their game was not simply an aesthetic choice, though it has aesthetic consequences. It was a philosophical position about what role-playing games could do that other media couldn't. Create situations where the player genuinely did not know in advance what the right thing to do was, and then lived with the consequences of their decision long enough to understand it better. The Brotherhood of Steel in the original Fallout are not presented as good or bad. They are presented as having a coherent set of priorities that the player might find sympathetic or monstrous, depending on what they value. The game does not tell you which response is correct, but it tracks your relationship with them, and that relationship affects what is possible later. This design philosophy has been maintained with varying degrees of success across the franchise's different development teams and creative directors. Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland sometimes tilts toward a more traditional hero-villain narrative than the original games did. Fallout 4 has been criticized for a dialogue system that reduces the player's expressive range and therefore the moral complexity of their choices. But Fallout New Vegas, in the hands of Obsidian Entertainment's team of former Black Isle developers, reconstructed the original game's moral architecture with a sophistication that may be the franchise's peak expression of this idea. The NCR, Caesar's Legion, Mr. House, and the independent option, none of them is simply correct. All of them are simultaneously defensible and indefensible, and the game tracks your reputation with each of them in ways that make the world feel genuinely responsive to who you've been throughout it. On the Vaults as American satire. The Vaults in the Fallout franchise are, among other things, a piece of sustained satire about American institutions and the relationship between those institutions and the people they claim to serve. The specific target of that satire has evolved across the franchise's history, but the core critique has remained consistent, that powerful institutions often pursue interests that diverge dramatically from the welfare of the people they officially represent, and that this divergence is frequently hidden behind language of service, protection, and common good. Vault-Tec sold the vaults as shelters. They were laboratories. The United States government commissioned the vaults as an act of public protection. They were actually a vehicle for corporate research into the question of how to build a generation ship, an entirely different agenda, pursued at enormous public cost in both money and human welfare, without disclosure or consent. The gap between official purpose and actual purpose is precisely the gap that the franchise is most interested in. The vaults are extreme examples of a pattern the games present as endemic to the pre-war civilization. Institutions that speak the language of the public good while pursuing the interests of the people who run them. This is what makes the Vault experiments feel like something more than horror set dressing. Vault 11's Annual Sacrifice. Vault 108's Manufactured Chaos. Vault 87's Forced Transformation. These are not random cruelties. They are the logical endpoint of a specific institutional logic applied to human beings who had been treated as data points rather than as people. The most disturbing thing about the Vault experiments is not their extremity but their plausibility. You can see, in each one, the specific kind of institutional thinking that produced it. The language of science was used to justify the removal of consent. The language of necessity was used to justify the removal of welfare. The language of the greater good was used to justify the removal of the individual good. The vaults are what happens when that thinking is applied without constraint. On the music and what it does, the decision to use 1940s and 1950s American popular music as the sonic backdrop for a post-apocalyptic franchise was not an obvious one, and it is worth spending a moment understanding what it accomplishes. These songs were not chosen because they were pleasant background music for a game set in ruins. They were chosen because they are, in a specific and audible sense, the voice of the civilization that produced the ruins. The post-war era in American popular culture was characterized by a specific tension, the celebration of prosperity and normalcy and domestic happiness existing simultaneously with the ambient anxiety of the nuclear arms race, and the knowledge that the same technological power that had produced post-war comfort was also capable of ending everything that comfort had made possible. The songs that played on American radio in the late 1940s and 1950s expressed the celebratory side of this tension. They were songs about love and optimism and the ordinary pleasures of a life worth living. What they didn't express was the anxiety. The anxiety was present but not audible in the music. It lived in the news, in the civil defense drills, in the fallout shelters being built in basements and backyards. The music was what you put on when you wanted to feel like the anxiety wasn't there. Playing these songs in the ruins of the civilization that produced them does something very specific. It makes the anxiety audible by making its absence visible. When you hear Anything Goes playing on a radio while you walk through the charred remains of a suburb, what you hear is both the song and its context. The song was produced by a civilization that believed it could afford permissiveness, that had enough security and prosperity to let things go without consequences. The ruins around you are the evidence that it couldn't. The song has become ironic, not because anyone added irony to it, but because the world it played in no longer exists. The cheerfulness that once felt like an expression of genuine contentment now reads as the sound of denial. And in the Fallout universe, denial produced the Great War as surely as any missile. On Obsidian Entertainment and what New Vegas represents? Fallout. New Vegas represents something unusual in the history of licensed game development. A game made by the people who would have made the franchise's third installment if history had gone differently, finally given the chance to do so in an indirect form. Obsidian Entertainment was founded by several of the core members of Black Isle Studios: Fergus Urquhart, Chris Avallone, Josh Sawyer, and others who had worked on the original Fallout games and on the cancelled Van Buren. When Bethesda offered them the opportunity to develop a New Vegas spin-off, they were not simply contractors working with a licensed property. They were, in a meaningful sense, returning to a franchise they had helped create and then been forced to leave. This gives New Vegas a quality that is unusual in sequels and spin-offs: the feeling of unfinished business being resolved. Elements of Van Buren that had been designed but never realized appeared in New Vegas. Caesar's Legion originated in Van Buren design documents, as did the Hoover Dam setting and various faction dynamics. Characters and quest structures that Avallone and Sawyer and others had conceived for the cancelled game found their way, in modified forms, into the released one. New Vegas is in some sense the game that Van Buren might have become, filtered through the different creative environment of 2010 and the specific constraints of being built on Fallout 3's technical foundation. The result is a game that simultaneously honors the Bethesda-era franchise and gently argues for a different set of creative priorities within it. New Vegas doesn't reject what Fallout 3 accomplished. It uses Fallout 3's engine, its asset library, its general open-world structure. But within that structure, it reasserts the moral complexity and the political seriousness of the original Black Isle games, arguing through its design that these qualities are not optional features of a good Fallout game, but essential ones. Whether or not this argument won definitively is a matter of ongoing fan debate. What is clear is that New Vegas made the argument with sufficient force that it is still being heard more than 15 years after its release. On power armor as symbol. Power armor in the Fallout franchise has always been more than equipment. From its very first appearance in the original game, where the player must acquire a suit to proceed through areas of the late game that would otherwise be fatal, it has functioned as a symbol of something larger than its mechanical properties. The specific thing it symbolizes has evolved across the franchise's history, but the symbolic weight has always been there. In the original Fallout and Fallout 2, power armor was rare and precious, something that the military elite of the old world had possessed, now preserved and fought over by the factions who understood its value. Wearing it made you dramatically more capable, but the act of wearing it also connected you to the pre-war world in a specific way. You were inhabiting the equipment of the civilization that had destroyed itself. The armor was a piece of that civilization's hubris, its belief that the right equipment could solve any problem now being used to navigate the world that hubris had produced. In Fallout 3 and New Vegas, power armor remained rare and symbolically significant, a mark of the Brotherhood of Steel's particular relationship to pre-war technology and their role as its preservers. In Fallout 4, the armor's role changed substantially. It became more accessible, reimagined as a vehicle the player climbed into rather than equipment they wore, and the symbolism shifted accordingly. Instead of something rare and charged with historical weight, power armor in Fallout 4 is more like the game's ultimate expression of player agency. The suit that makes you feel like the most capable thing in the wasteland, a walking fortress against everything the Commonwealth can throw at you. This shift has been controversial among fans, but it reflects something true about how the franchise had evolved between 1997 and 2015, from a game about scarcity and careful decision-making to a game about the player's capacity to master their environment. On the franchise's cultural footprint, the Fallout franchise's cultural footprint extends well beyond its sales figures and its critical reception, though both are impressive. The games have shaped how a significant portion of the people who played them think about nuclear anxiety, about post-apocalyptic aesthetics, about the relationship between corporate institutions and public welfare, and about what role-playing games can do as a form. Players who discovered Fallout at formative ages often describe it as one of the works that most influenced their values and their worldview, not in a simple, prescriptive sense, but in the sense that it gave them a set of questions to take with them through their lives. The franchise has also produced one of the most active and most intellectually engaged fan communities in gaming. The Fallout Wiki is a genuinely remarkable document, millions of words of collaboratively produced knowledge, covering the franchise's lore, history, mechanics, and secrets in exhaustive detail. The modding community for the Bethesda Fallout games has produced work of genuine artistic ambition, total conversions, large-scale expansions, detailed recreations of locations from earlier games within newer engines. The cosplay community produces armor and outfit recreations that demonstrate craft and dedication that go well beyond casual enthusiasm. Fan fiction, fan art, and fan analysis fill corners of the internet that the franchise's official presence could not have reached. This community is itself part of what Fallout is. The games created a world detailed enough to sustain deep engagement, complex enough to reward analysis, and open enough to invite creative response. The players who have spent hundreds of hours in the various wastelands are not just consumers of a product, they are participants in an ongoing conversation about the world the games describe and about what it means. That conversation has been going on since 1997, and it shows no signs of stopping. On what the franchise has said about America, Fallout is, at its heart, a franchise about America. Not the actual America of 1997 or 2025, but a specific version of America, the America of the post-war imagination, the America that the civil defense films and the advertising campaigns and the congressional speeches of the 1950s were trying to construct, an America of permanent prosperity, of nuclear-powered technology and gleaming suburbs, of a future that was obviously, unmistakably better than the past. An America that had won the war and deserved to win the peace, that had the right and the capability to organize the world according to its own values. The Fallout games ask, in various ways, what happened to that America? Not by presenting it as a lie the franchise is too sophisticated for simple debunking, but by following the logic of it to its endpoint. If you believe that technology is the solution to human problems, you eventually build the technological solution that ends civilization. If you believe that your civilization has the right to organize the world according to its own values, you eventually fight wars over resources with no end in sight. If you believe that institutions can be trusted to pursue the public good without accountability, you eventually have Vault-Tec. The wasteland is what America looks like when the post-war American project runs to its conclusion. This is not a simple anti-American critique. The franchise is too in love with the aesthetic of that America with the chrome and the tail fins and the gleaming optimism and yes, even the ink spots to be simply critical of it. It is more like a troubled love letter. The Fallout universe is seduced by mid-century American aesthetics and horrified by mid-century American assumptions. And it can't entirely resolve this tension, because neither could the people who produce the games. Because neither can we. We live in a world that still uses the products of post-war American optimism, the nuclear technology, the institutional structures, the economic systems, and we're still working out what we think about all of it. Fallout gives us a way to think about it by rendering it at its most extreme, by following the logic to the end, by showing us the mushroom cloud that the post-war American project had always been building toward. and then it gives us a wasteland to walk through and asks us what we'd like to build instead. Further explorations, the stories behind the stories. On the creation of believable worlds. What makes the Fallout universe feel believable genuinely, substantively real in the way that the best science fiction worlds feel real, is the density and consistency of its internal logic. Every element of the world is connected to every other element through chains of cause and effect that hold together under scrutiny. The reason the Pip-Boy is wrist-mounted, the reason super mutants look the way they do, the reason the Brotherhood of Steel hoards technology, the reason vaults have the specific aesthetic they have, these are all connected to a coherent history that you can trace backward and forward through the timeline and find consistent. This consistency was deliberately constructed, and it required an enormous amount of work from the writers and designers across multiple studios and multiple decades to maintain it. The original Fallout team built the world's foundational logic, the specific nature of the Great War, the role of Vault-Tec, the history of the Brotherhood of Steel, the mechanics of FEV and super mutant creation. Fallout 2 expanded on this foundation, adding the new California Republic, the Enclave, and the post-war political landscape of the West Coast. Subsequent games, whether Bethesda's East Coast explorations or Obsidian's return to the West Coast in New Vegas, have had to work within this established framework while also adding to it, filling in gaps without contradicting what had already been established. This is genuinely difficult work. The history of large shared fictional universes is full of contradictions, retcons, and internal inconsistencies that accumulate over time as different creative teams work within the same space. Fallout has not been entirely immune to this. There are continuity questions and interpretive disagreements among fans about how certain elements fit together, but the franchise's track record for internal consistency is substantially better than most shared fictional universes of comparable scope and age. Part of what has made this possible is the Fallout Wiki and the fan communities that maintain it. These communities have, over decades, documented the franchise's lore in exhaustive detail, catching inconsistencies, tracing connections between different games' treatments of the same events, and collectively building a shared understanding of the world's internal rules that often exceeds what any individual writer or designer could hold in their head at one time. The Wiki has become a resource that the game's creators themselves use, a collaboratively maintained document of the world's own internal logic that feeds back into the creative process in ways that help maintain consistency across development teams and years. On the Brotherhood of Steel's complicated legacy, the Brotherhood of Steel is the franchise's most persistent faction and, in some ways, its most contested. They appear in every mainline game and in several spin-offs, and their characterization has shifted substantially across different development teams and different creative eras. Understanding how the Brotherhood has been presented differently in different games, and why those differences matter, is a way of understanding some of the deeper tensions in the franchise's creative history. In the original Fallout, the Brotherhood was a morally ambiguous organization, technologically powerful, ideologically distinctive, and fundamentally indifferent to the welfare of the wasteland's civilian population. They preserved technology because they believed technology was the most important thing to preserve, not because they wanted to use that technology to help anyone. They were neither heroic nor villainous. They were simply operating according to their own priorities, which were not the same as the players. In Fallout 3, Bethesda made a creative choice that substantially shifted the Brotherhood's characterization. The East Coast chapter of the Brotherhood was presented as more altruistic than the West Coast chapter had been, more interested in protecting civilians and fighting for the wasteland's future. This was a deliberate creative decision, made partly because Bethesda wanted players to have a faction they could align with as protagonists, and partly because the East Coast chapter's history, as developed in Fallout 3, provided justification for this different orientation. But it created a tension with the franchise's established portrayal of the Brotherhood, and many fans of the original games found the Fallout 3 Brotherhood too sympathetic, too heroic, too much like conventional good guys in a franchise that had always resisted the conventional good guy. New Vegas returned to something closer to the original game's more ambiguous portrayal, with the Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood in conflict with the NCR and following a more orthodox version of the Brotherhood's traditional doctrine. And Fallout 4's Brotherhood, under the leadership of Elder Maxon, move the faction in a direction that made them much harder to view sympathetically aggressive, expansionist, willing to pursue genocide against the synths. The arc of the Brotherhood's portrayal across the Bethesda games is, in some ways, the story of Bethesda working out how heroic or ambiguous they wanted their franchise to be, oscillating between the moral complexity of the original games and the pull toward more conventional narrative roles. On the specific art of Fallout's humor, Fallout has always been funny. This is easy to miss because the franchise is also dark, also politically serious, also genuinely emotionally affecting in its best moments. But the humor has always been there, threading through the darkness in ways that are characteristic and essential to what the games feel like. Understanding what kind of humor it is helps explain why it works. The humor in Fallout is, at its core, the humor of incongruity, the specific comedy that arises when things that belong in entirely different registers are placed in direct contact with each other. The cheerful Vault Boy mascot on a poster for a facility that is secretly running non-consensual experiments on its inhabitants. The upbeat 1950s jingle playing on the radio while the player fights a deathclaw in the burnt ruins of a suburb. The robot programmed with the customer service personality of a 1950s diner waitress, now wandering through a post-nuclear wasteland offering everyone pie. These jokes work because the incongruity is not arbitrary, it is historically and thematically grounded. The cheerfulness of 1950s American popular culture and the catastrophe that culture produced really are in this kind of incongruous relationship, and the humor is the sound of that incongruity being pointed to and named. The other characteristic mode of Fallout humor is the kind that arises from the deadpan application of bureaucratic or institutional logic to extreme circumstances. The Vault-Tec promotional materials maintaining their tone of cheerful customer service while describing experiments that are, in any human terms, monstrous. The government agencies in the game's lore continuing to file reports and send memos right up until the moment the bombs fall. The terminal entries from Vault-Tec researchers assessing the progress of experiments on human beings in the language of performance reviews. These jokes work because they are recognizable. We have all encountered institutional language being used to normalize things that should not be normalized, and the franchise is simply taking that process to its logical extreme. Gary the cloned, endlessly reproduced, increasingly violent resident of Vault 108 who can say nothing except his own name, is both of these humor modes at once. He is incongruous in the most extreme possible way, a vault full of copies of the same increasingly unhinged person, all named Gary, all articulating only Gary, all constituting the entirety of what a human society has produced in this sealed environment. And he is also a product of institutional logic taken to its extreme. Someone took the idea of cloning and ran it through the logic of a failing vault until it produced this. Gary is funny. Gary is also genuinely disturbing. The combination is pure Fallout. On the craft of environmental storytelling, one of the things the Fallout franchise does consistently better than almost any other game series is environmental storytelling, the art of telling stories through the physical arrangement of objects, spaces, and evidence, without explicit exposition. The franchise has developed this craft across multiple development teams and decades, and the best examples of it remain among the most effective demonstrations of what video games can do as a narrative medium. The principle behind effective environmental storytelling in Fallout is that the world should contain evidence of what happened, not descriptions of what happened, but physical traces. A collection of personal items arranged in a specific way. A skeleton positioned in a way that implies something about the final moments of the person who left it. A sequence of terminal entries that, taken together, tell a story that no single entry alone could tell. A group of bodies in positions that suggest the dynamics of a final encounter. A child's bedroom preserved exactly as it was left, alongside a fallout shelter in the basement that was not quite completed in time. What makes these stories affecting is that they require something from the player to complete them. You have to notice the details. You have to put them together. You have to construct the narrative from the evidence rather than receive it as a presentation. This active role in the storytelling creates a different emotional engagement than passive reception would. You feel when you piece together what happened to the family in the house, as though you are discovering something that was really there, as though you are finding a real record of real events, rather than reading a story someone has written. The illusion is complete in a way that is specific to this medium and this approach to storytelling, and the Fallout franchise has used it with remarkable consistency across its long history. On the question of what makes a good Fallout game, the question of what makes a Fallout game good is one that the franchise's fan community has argued about continuously since Bethesda took over the property in 2007, and that argument has intensified with each new release. The positions in this argument have roughly settled into a few camps. Those who believe the franchise's essential qualities are its open-ended RPG mechanics, its moral complexity, and its writing, and who tend to prefer the Black Isle and Obsidian games. Those who value the Bethesda game's open-world exploration, environmental storytelling, and technical polish, and those who believe the franchise can successfully be multiple things to different audiences, and that the debate is a category error. What is interesting about this argument, when you look at it carefully, is that the different camps are not actually arguing about different things. They are arguing about priorities about which of the franchise's many qualities is most essential to what it is. Is Fallout fundamentally an RPG that happens to have an open world, or is it fundamentally an open world that happens to have RPG elements? Is the moral complexity of the faction design the core of what makes the franchise distinctive? Or is the post-apocalyptic setting and atmosphere the core, with the moral complexity as a valuable but not essential feature? Is the specific 1950s aesthetic essential to the franchise's identity? Or is the post-nuclear survival premise the essential element, with the aesthetic as one possible expression of it? These questions do not have definitive answers, and the franchise itself has not resolved them through its history. Different studios have made different choices about priorities, and the games that resulted have been good or less good in different ways as a result. What the argument reveals, more than anything else, is how rich and multidimensional the franchise is that it contains enough different elements of sufficient quality that entirely different creative visions can be pursued within it, and that players can form genuine attachments to entirely different aspects of what it offers. On Fallout's relationship with time, one of the franchise's more distinctive formal qualities is its relationship with time. The games take place at specific moments in a long post-war history, but each game also gives you access to the recent and more distant past through the holotapes and terminal entries and physical evidence scattered throughout the world. You are always navigating two timelines simultaneously: the present of the game, in which you are making choices and taking actions, and the past of the world, which shaped the present and which you can access through the fragments it left behind. This dual temporality creates a specific quality of experience that is difficult to achieve in other narrative media. In a novel or a film, you typically move through time in the direction the story directs you. In the best Fallout games, you construct your understanding of the world's history as you explore it, assembling fragments in whatever order the geography of your exploration brings you to them. You might understand the end of Vault 11's story before you understand its beginning. You might know what happened to a family without knowing why they were in the specific building where their remains are found. The meaning of what you find is shaped by the sequence in which you find it, which varies between players and between playthroughs, creating experiences that are genuinely individualized in ways that go beyond simply choosing different dialogue options. This relationship with time also gives the franchise's best moments a specific kind of emotional weight. When you find the final terminal entry of a Vault-Tec researcher who has just understood what they have participated in, and you read their attempt to process that understanding, you are experiencing something that happened 200 years before the game's present, a moment from a dead world, preserved in digital amber, that the world has moved on from in every possible way, except that this record exists and you have found it. The emotion is not about what is happening in the game's present. It is about what happened in the game's past, and about the specific quality of encountering a past moment as though it were still present. Fallout does this better than almost anything else. On why the franchise continues to matter, Fallout has been making roughly the same argument since 1997, and that argument has not lost its relevance. If anything, it has gained it. The franchise has always been about the relationship between technological capability and human wisdom, about the specific dangers of institutional power wielded without accountability, about the way that the logic of certainty, the belief that you know what needs to be done and that the ends justify the means, tends to produce catastrophic outcomes. These are not historical concerns. They are present ones. The Great War of 2077 was not produced by uniquely villainous people making uniquely bad choices. It was produced by people operating within institutional and economic structures that incentivized specific behaviors and discouraged reflection on where those behaviors were leading. The corporations that built the vaults were responding to market incentives. The government that funded Project Safehouse was responding to political incentives. The military that deployed the first power armor on the Chinese mainland was responding to strategic incentives. None of the individual decisions, taken in isolation, looks like the choice to destroy civilization. But taken together, followed to their logical conclusions, they produced exactly that. The franchise's argument is not that people are uniquely evil or that civilization is uniquely fragile. Its argument is that specific structural dynamics, pursued without wisdom or accountability or the capacity for genuine self-reflection, tend towards specific kinds of catastrophe. And it is worth paying attention to what those dynamics look like, because they are recognizable. The wasteland is not a warning about a future that hasn't happened yet. It is a thought experiment about the futures that are always latent in the present, the directions that present conditions could develop if specific assumptions go unexamined and specific choices keep being made. Walking through it, choosing what to do within it, thinking about what kind of community you want to build from what remains, these are not just game activities. They are a rehearsal for the kinds of thinking that the actual present requires. Fallout has always known this, in the way that the best genre fiction knows it. It just hides it in rubble and neon, and the sound of the ink spots playing on a radio that hasn't been turned off in 200 years. A final word on the people who made it. The Fallout franchise was made by human beings who cared deeply about what they were making. This is true of the 30 people who built the original game in the mid-1990s, and it is true of the larger teams at Bethesda and Obsidian and the other studios that have contributed to the franchise since then. The care is visible in the work in the specific quality of attention that went into the faction design, the environmental storytelling, the music choices, the vault experiments, the companion arcs, the hidden lore, the developer Easter eggs, the references and in-jokes and tributes scattered throughout the games. These are not features of a product optimized for commercial performance. They are the marks of people who were genuinely invested in the world they were building and who wanted to give the people who played in it something worth finding. The story of Tim Kaine building the original Fallout prototype alone in the gaps between Interplay's commercially important projects is, among other things, a story about what creative stubbornness can produce when given enough time and enough obscurity. The story of Chris Taylor writing the speckle system on index cards under time pressure after the GURPS deal fell apart is a story about how constraints can produce clarity. The story of Obsidian building New Vegas in 18 months is a story about what experience and genuine creative conviction can accomplish, even when the conditions for producing great work are not optimal. These stories are part of what Fallout is, just as surely as the Vault experiments and the Vault Boy and the War Never Changes narration. The franchise is the product of specific human beings who faced specific challenges and made specific choices under specific constraints. And the quality of what they produced reflects the quality of those choices. It is easy, looking at a franchise of this scale and this cultural presence, to forget that it was made by people, that there was a specific person who decided that the ink spots, "I don't want to set the world on fire," was the right song for the opening of Fallout 3's marketing campaign, and that this specific person's specific taste produced something that has lived in millions of people's heads ever since. The franchise is made of choices like that one. Small, specific, human choices whose effects rippled outward in ways nobody could have predicted. That is, perhaps, the most Fallout thing about Fallout, that it was built through the same process it describes. Small choices, made by specific people, carrying consequences that spread further and lasted longer than anyone imagined at the moment of making them. War never changes. But the things people make, and the choices they make in making them, those change everything. The lore that lives in the margins. On Nuka-Cola and the art of the fictional brand, Nuka-Cola is one of the Fallout franchise's most sustained and most successful pieces of world building, and it is worth examining as a creative achievement in its own right. The fictional soft drink was supposedly first created in 2044 and grew throughout the pre-war period into the dominant beverage brand of the United States. By the time of the Great War, Nuka-Cola was omnipresent. In every vending machine, on every billboard, in every gas station convenience rack, in every television commercial, in the hands of every smiling Vault boy, in every promotional material that Vault-Tec and its corporate partners produced. It is a piece of world building that does something specific. It gives the pre-war world a recognizable commercial texture that grounds the larger satirical project in something concrete and familiar. Everyone who plays Fallout understands what Nuka-Cola is, because they understand what Coca-Cola is, and the relationship between the two is close enough to produce recognition without requiring exact duplication. What makes Nuka-Cola more interesting than simple corporate satire is the way the franchise has developed it across games. Nuka-Cola bottles are among the most valuable trade goods in the wasteland because the drinks were sealed in a way that keeps them stable indefinitely. They are currency, they are collectibles, they are evidence of the pre-war world scattered throughout the ruins. In Fallout 4's Nuka World DLC, the franchise committed fully to the bit, an entire theme park built around the brand, with different sections exploring different aspects of the Nuka-Cola marketing universe, all of it now overgrown and occupied by raiders and mutants, and the various post-war entities that have moved into the physical infrastructure of the pre-war commercial world. It is one of the stranger pieces of world building in the franchise, a theme park dedicated to a soda brand, rendered as a post-apocalyptic location, and it works because the brand itself has been developed with sufficient depth and consistency that the theme park feels like a logical extension of it. The specific flavors of Nuka-Cola that appear across the games are themselves tiny pieces of world building. Nuka-Cola Quantum, with its mildly radioactive isotope additive that gives it a distinctive blue glow and an unusual kick, suggests a pre-war regulatory environment so captured by corporate interests that a beverage company could add radioactive material to a consumer product and have it approved for sale. Nuka-Cola Cherry, the regional variant that appears in the Nuka World DLC, suggests the same regional marketing differentiation that real beverage companies practice. The care put into the development of the brand across games reflects the franchise's broader commitment to treating its fictional world as though it had real history, real economics, and real commercial culture. On robots and what they represent. The robots in the Fallout franchise, Mr. Handy, Mr. Gutsy, Protectrons, Sentrybots, Securitrons, Robobrains are not simply enemies or companions. They are pieces of world building that serve a specific function. They are the pre-war world's expectations about the future, preserved in operational form, and released into a present that has moved on entirely from the assumptions those expectations embodied. Mr. Handy, the hovering domestic robot with its cheerful English butler persona, was designed to be the perfect household companion, friendly, efficient, servile, perpetually ready to help. In the Fallout universe, it succeeded at being exactly this, and you can find fully functional Mr. Handy units throughout the games, still performing the domestic functions they were programmed for in houses where the humans they served died 200 years ago. Still cooking meals no one will eat. Still watering plants no one will see. Still reminding non-existent family members that their appointments are coming up. The joke is obvious, but the emotional register is not purely comedic. There is something genuinely melancholy about an optimized domestic helper continuing to fulfill its purpose after the fulfillment has become pointless about a piece of technology that worked exactly as designed, that has continued working exactly as designed for 2 centuries, and whose continued perfect functioning is now the saddest thing about it. The Securitrons in New Vegas, the spherical robots that serve as Mr. House's police force on the Strip, are a different kind of statement. They project 2 different faces depending on their programming mode. Officer Watkins, the friendly community policeman, for ordinary interactions, and a grinning soldier's skull for combat mode. This visual dichotomy captures something specific about what House has built in New Vegas, a stability maintained by the constant threat of overwhelming force, presented with a veneer of cheerful civic normalcy. The Securitrons are both the face of order and the reality of power, and the shift between their 2 faces is a visual metaphor for what they actually are. On the deep lore of the factions, every major faction in the Fallout franchise has a backstory that extends well beyond what any individual game shows you, And exploring those backstories reveals how much thought has gone into constructing the political landscape of the post-war world. The New California Republic traces its origins to a group of survivors from Vault 15, a vault whose experiment involved different groups with different cultural backgrounds being placed together, a recipe for the faction fragmentation that actually occurred when the vault opened. Different groups split off and became different factions. The Jackals, the Vipers, and the Khans were three raider gangs that emerged from Vault 15's population, while the founding community of Shady Sands developed into what eventually became the NCR. This origin, a civilization born from the survivors of a social experiment, gives the NCR a specific and interesting quality. It is a democracy that emerged from conditions of radical adversity, that has had to construct its institutions from scratch, and that carries within it the legacy of the chaos that preceded its founding. The NCR's current struggles with corruption and overextension are not incidental to its history. They are the predictable development of institutions that were built under pressure and have not had the time or the stability to develop the deep structural safeguards that older, more established democracies have accumulated over centuries. The Institute's history is less fully explored in the games, but equally interesting. The organization grew from the survivors of MIT in the decades after the Great War, a community of scientists and researchers who believed that their expertise and their capability gave them both the right and the responsibility to shape what the post-war world would become. The specific form that belief took: withdrawal from the surface world, development of synthetic humans, eventual plans to replace or supplement the surface population with synths they considered more controllable and more aligned with the Institute's values, reflects a specific kind of technocratic hubris that the franchise treats with skepticism, even as it presents the Institute's perspective with enough sympathy to be understandable. The Institute genuinely believes it is acting for humanity's benefit. The specific way it has chosen to act for that benefit reflects assumptions about who gets to make decisions about humanity's future that the game invites you to examine. On the question of hope, it would be easy to look at the Fallout franchise, at its nuclear wastelands, and its institutional cynicism, and its vault experiments, and its recurring wars, and conclude that it is a fundamentally hopeless view of human nature and human civilization. This would be a misreading, and understanding why it is a misreading is part of understanding what the franchise is actually doing. The wasteland in every Fallout game contains suffering and cruelty and the ongoing consequences of catastrophic human failure. But it also contains communities that work, relationships that sustain people, moments of genuine kindness and cooperation and creativity. The settlements the player encounters: Good Springs, Diamond City, Rivet City, Megaton, the various survivor communities scattered through the game's wastelands, are not simply backdrops for action. They are evidence of human resilience, of the capacity of people, even after civilization-ending catastrophe, to organize themselves into functional communities, to establish norms and rules and relationships, to build something worth caring about out of whatever remains. The franchise's treatment of hope is specific and careful. It does not offer cheap optimism, the assertion that things will work out because they always work out, that civilization will recover because it always recovers, that the good guys will win because they are the good guys. Instead, it offers what might be called grounded hope, the recognition that human beings have genuinely remarkable capacities for adaptation and creativity and cooperation, that these capacities persist even under extremely adverse conditions, and that the outcomes in the wasteland are not predetermined. Whether the NCR's democracy survives its overextension, whether New Vegas flourishes or collapses, whether the Commonwealth's scattered communities build something sustainable, these things depend on choices, and choices remain open. The franchise insists, against all the evidence of the apocalypse that surrounds you, that the choices still matter, that what you do still makes a difference, that the wasteland is not a place where the story has already been written, but a place where the story is still being made. This is, perhaps, the deepest thing Fallout believes, that human history is not over, that the catastrophe is not the end, that the people who survive have not simply been condemned to live out the consequences of the choices that destroyed the world. They are, all of them, still choosing. And so are you. Thank you for spending this time in the wasteland. These 101 facts, and the reflections that accompanied them, are an attempt to do justice to a franchise that has meant a great deal to a great many people over a very long time. If you made it here, drop a comment. Tell me where you are and what time it is. And if the wasteland has given you something to think about tonight, all the better. War never changes, but the people walking through the rubble keep on choosing. Sleep well. One final pass through the wasteland. On the specific quality of post-apocalyptic solitude, there is a quality that the best Fallout games create, particularly in their quieter moments, in the stretches between settlements when you are simply walking through the wasteland that is difficult to name precisely. It is something like solitude, but not exactly. It is the feeling of moving through a space that was once full of people and is now empty, of occupying an environment that still bears the physical traces of a human presence that is no longer there. The pre-war houses with their furniture intact, the playgrounds with their swing sets still standing, the parking lots with their rusted car hulks arranged in rows. These places were made by people, for people, and the people are gone, and what remains is a world that has the texture of human habitation without the content. The Fallout franchise has always understood that this specific quality of the post-apocalyptic environment is one of the things that distinguishes it from other settings. A fantasy world, however detailed, does not have this relationship to a specific, recognizable past. A science fiction world set in the distant future does not have it either. But a post-apocalyptic world set in a future extrapolated from our own recent past does have it, because the houses and the playgrounds and the parking lots are recognizable to us, because we have seen things like them, because they activate memories and associations that purely invented settings cannot. The emotional effect is something between nostalgia and grief, the feeling of recognizing something you love in the process of being lost. This effect is strengthened by the music, by the specific choices of what to play on the radio stations. The songs that play over the empty wasteland were written for and recorded in the world that those houses belong to. They were the soundtrack of the people who built and inhabited those playgrounds and parking lots. Hearing them in the absence of the people who listened to them creates a doubling. The present emptiness and the past fullness, held in tension by the continuing sound of music that was made for a world that no longer exists. On the specific genius of the War Never Changes structure, the specific structure of Ron Perlman's opening narration in each Fallout game is worth examining carefully because it is more sophisticated than it initially appears. The narration always begins with war never changes, and then the narration that follows the line varies between games, describing the specific version of the world the player is entering. This structure does something that few games have managed. It creates a sense of historical continuity across an entire franchise, while simultaneously grounding each individual game in its own specific moment and place. By beginning every game with the same 4 words, the franchise signals to the player that they are entering the same universe they have visited before, that the events of previous games and the world building those games established still hold. The continuity of the opening phrase is a continuity of world, of history, of the specific conditions that produce the wasteland. But by immediately following those 4 words with narration specific to this game's time and place, the franchise also signals that each game is its own thing, its own window onto the larger history, its own moment, its own set of specific circumstances that the player will have to navigate. The structure manages to be both a statement of continuity and a statement of particularity at once. This structural elegance has made the "War Never Changes" phrase something more than a tagline. It has become, over the decades of the franchise's history, a kind of liturgy, a phrase that carries the accumulated weight of every game that has used it, that carries the specific emotional memories of every player who has heard it at the beginning of their first Fallout experience, that signals by its mere utterance that you are about to enter a specific and rich and carefully constructed world that has been waiting for you. On the relationship between the games and the television series, the 2024 Amazon Prime television series represents a genuinely new chapter in the franchise's history, not because it is the first time Fallout has appeared in a medium other than video games, but because it is the first time the franchise has achieved significant cultural presence in a mass-market medium that reaches audiences who will never play the games. The millions of people who watched the first season of the Fallout show without prior exposure to the franchise are now part of a much larger conversation about the universe that the games created, And their participation in that conversation is changing the shape of the franchise's cultural life in ways that are still becoming apparent. The decision to set the television series within the game's canonical universe rather than as a separate adaptation was, in retrospect, clearly the right choice. It meant that the show added to the world the games had built, rather than creating a parallel version of it that would have competed with and potentially contradicted the game's version. It meant that fans of the games could watch the show as a genuine extension of the universe they loved, rather than as an adaptation that might or might not respect what they cared about. And it meant that the new audiences the show created were being introduced to the same world the games depict, so that if they chose to explore the games after watching the show, they would find the same history, the same factions, the same philosophical concerns. The show's first season accomplished something remarkable. It told a genuinely new story within the Fallout universe, following characters who had not previously existed, visiting locations that had not previously appeared, and adding new canonical events to the history while remaining faithful to the aesthetic, tonal, and thematic identity of the franchise. This is not a trivial achievement. It requires a deep understanding of what makes the franchise what it is, and a creative team willing to subordinate their own preferences to the requirements of serving that identity. On what the franchise has given us. If you have watched this video all the way through, you have spent a significant amount of time thinking about a franchise that has itself been thinking about a specific set of questions for nearly 30 years. What does it mean to survive in a world shaped by the worst choices of the people who came before you? What do you owe to the communities you move through? What kind of civilization is worth building from what remains? What does it mean to make choices in a world where the consequences of choices extend further and last longer than the people who make them can predict? These are not small questions. They are, in fact, among the most important questions that anyone can be asking at any point in history, but they are particularly urgent in our period, when the specific dynamics that the Fallout universe depicts as the cause of its apocalypse are visibly present in the actual world. The resource conflicts, the institutional capture, the corporate indifference to the welfare of the people whose lives their decisions affect, the tendency to pursue technological capability without sufficient reflection on whether the use of that capability is wise, the specific form of certainty that believes it knows what the future should look like and is willing to pay any price to bring that future about. Fallout has been telling us something about these dynamics for 27 years. It has been doing it through irradiated mutant crabs and cheerful robot butlers and 1940s love songs, and the specific existential weight of walking through the ruins of a suburb and understanding that the people who built it thought they were building something permanent. The packaging is strange and the humor is dark, and the specific mechanisms of delivery are unique to the medium of interactive entertainment. But the message underneath all of it has been consistent and clear. Pay attention to what you are building and who it serves, and whether the logic of what you are doing leads somewhere that you would choose if you could see it clearly. Because the people who built the world that became the Fallout Wasteland were not villains. They were people making choices within systems that incentivized specific behaviors and obscured the consequences of those behaviors. They were people who thought they were building something good, and they were wrong in the specific way that the franchise has spent 30 years trying to help us understand. Walk carefully in the wasteland. The world out there is watching. It is worth pausing here, just before the end, to reflect on something that often goes unspoken when people talk about the Fallout franchise: the fact that it has produced, across its long history, some of the most genuinely affecting emotional moments in video games. Not the biggest or most spectacular, not the cinematic crescendos that AAA productions now routinely deliver with orchestral scores and motion capture and facial animation technology that can render every micro-expression, but quieter moments, more specific ones. The moment in New Vegas when you hear the final audio log in Vault 11 and understand what it means. The moment in Fallout 4 when you learn the truth about Sean and realize how long everything has taken. The moment in Fallout 3 when your father dies in the purification chamber and the world you've spent 40 hours building relationships in has to be rebuilt around the absence of the person who anchored it. These moments work not because they are technically impressive, but because the game spent so much time building the world and the relationships that made them meaningful. The emotion is earned. It is the payoff of sustained investment in a world that was made to care about, by people who cared about making it. That care is the through line of the franchise's history. From Tim Kaine building a prototype in the gaps between Interplay's commercial priorities, to the team at Obsidian rebuilding the franchise's creative identity under an 18-month deadline, to the writers at Bethesda who have been expanding and deepening the world with each new entry. The franchise has not always been perfect. No franchise of this age and this scope could be, but it has always been cared for, and the care is visible in the work. Walk through the wasteland long enough, and you feel it. A closing thought? There is a specific moment that every longtime Fallout player knows, even if they have never tried to name it. It happens somewhere in the middle of a long session, not at the beginning, when everything is new and overwhelming, and not at the end, when the narrative is rushing toward resolution, but in the quiet middle, when you have been walking through the wasteland for a while and have started to understand its rhythms. You come over a hill, or you emerge from a building, and the world opens up ahead of you. The Geiger counter ticks. The radio plays something from 60 years before the bombs fell. The light comes through the overcast sky in a specific way that is unmistakably the light of the Fallout universe, and nowhere else. And for a moment, the world is completely quiet except for the music and the ticking and the wind, and you understand, again, why you keep coming back to this place. That moment is what the franchise has been building toward. In every design decision, and every piece of writing, and every musical choice, and every Vault experiment, and every line of Ron Perlman's narration. It is not a moment of triumph or resolution. It is a moment of recognition. The feeling of being in a place that has been made with care and with conviction, and with a specific and sustained vision of what it should be, and of finding that place genuinely worth being in. The Fallout franchise has been making that moment possible for 27 years. The 101 facts in this video are, each of them, small pieces of how it was done. The wasteland will still be there when you wake up. That is, perhaps the best thing you can say about it. Good night, sleep well. The ink spots are playing somewhere out in the dark. The games themselves have a quality of patience that is unusual in commercial entertainment. They reward you for slowing down, for reading things that do not need to be read, for exploring places that have no quest markers pointing to them. The terminal entries that document the last days of a family that did not make it to a vault in time are not required reading. Nobody will tell you they are there, but they are there, and finding them, you understand something about the world that you would not have understood otherwise. The willingness to put this kind of content into the games, to invest in writing and designing things that many players will never see, that are there only for the people who look, is itself a statement about what the franchise believes games can be. Not just delivery systems for quests and combat encounters and character progression, but worlds. Places you can inhabit for hundreds of hours and still find something new, still find something someone made for you to find when you were ready to look. That is the highest ambition of the Fallout franchise, and it is the one it has come closest to achieving, to build a world worth being in. A world that rewards your attention, that gives back something real for the time you invest in it, that has things to say that you could not have heard anywhere else in quite the same way. The wasteland is ruined, and dangerous, and full of grief and dark humor and very old music playing in the dark. It is also, for the people who love it, one of the most carefully constructed and most genuinely inhabited fictional spaces that the medium of video games has ever produced. That is worth remembering, and worth celebrating, and worth spending a few hours thinking about before you fall asleep. The ink spots are playing, the Geiger counter is quiet, the wasteland is waiting. Good night.